Hello, and welcome back to the Electronic Intifada's live stream for Thursday, March 6th. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Nora Barrows-Friedman with my colleagues Ali Abunimah, Jon Elmer, Asawen Stanley, and Tamara Nassar. It's day 47 of the ceasefire. Coming up, we'll speak with Leah Whitson, the executive director of the human rights group DAWN, to talk about their new complaint to the International Criminal Court against U.S. officials, including Joe Biden, over their role in Israel's genocide. We'll also be joined by students at Barnard College in New York City to talk about the crackdown by both the university administration and the Trump administration against students involved in Palestine solidarity activity. Our contributor Abubaker Abed will also join us live from Gaza. And later on in the program, Jon will break down the Qassam Brigade's October 7th raid on the Nahal Oz military base using the just-released investigation by the Israeli military and Qassam's own footage of the operation. But first, here's a brief summary of some of the latest developments this week in Palestine. In Gaza, the holy month of Ramadan has begun, but Palestinians are bracing for yet more scarcity of food and supplies after Israel ordered the crossings to be closed on March 2nd, in violation of the ceasefire terms and international law. Israel's order to close the crossings was seen by Palestinian civil society as an act of sabotage against the ceasefire agreement, as it is supposed to move on to stage 2 of the 3 stages that began in January. Israeli Prime Minister and war crimes suspect Benjamin Netanyahu threatened Hamas with even more consequences if it does not agree to extend phase 1 of their ceasefire agreement and release the remaining Israeli captives held in Gaza, which was not laid out in the stage 1 process. The Hamas political party responded that the Israeli government's move to close the crossings and cut off international aid was, quote, cheap extortion, a war crime, and a blatant attack on the ceasefire. The Palestinian Foreign Affairs Ministry stated that it rejected Israel's use of, quote, politicizing aid and using it as a means of blackmail, deepening the suffering of more than 2 million Palestinians, adding to their current state of suffering due to the genocidal war and displacement. Euromed Human Rights Monitor noted that senior Israeli officials have made public, openly genocidal statements in the last few days, including Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, saying Israel should open, quote, the gates of hell. Smotrich declared that halting the entry of humanitarian aid into Gaza is an important step in the right direction, further stating that Israel must open those gates as quickly and lethally as possible on the cruel enemy until absolute victory. Israeli Foreign Minister Gideon Sa'ar dismissed warnings from the United Nations and international organizations regarding the risk of renewed famine in the Gaza Strip amid the tightened blockade and halting of humanitarian aid. Sa'ar said he considered these warnings to be, quote, just a lie, and affirmed that the Israeli government has no commitment to delivering humanitarian aid. Israeli Knesset member Almog Cohen urged Israeli forces to kill Palestinians in Gaza, quote, with no mercy during the holy month of Ramadan, saying it is, quote, the best time to kill them because they are weak and tired. Reporting from a market in Khan Yunis, Al Jazeera's Tarek Abu Azum said on Wednesday that, quote, prices have skyrocketed due to the potential scarcity of products and in light of the large consumption of people who have started to store food in preparation for the renewed starvation of the territory as long as the Israeli decision will remain in place. The United Nations World Food Programme stated on Wednesday that it only has enough food stores to keep public kitchens and bakeries open for fewer than 2 weeks, as long as the crossings remain sealed. The Gaza government media office stated on Tuesday that the continuation of the ban on food, medicine, and basic supplies, quote, means the return of the specter of famine again. The health situation will also continue to worsen, the office added, quote, by preventing the entry of medicines and medical supplies, which means a death sentence for thousands of chronic patients and the injured due to the lack of health care, and a death sentence for the health system that has already collapsed due to the deliberate sabotage and destruction of the occupation army for 15 months. In addition to the banning of aid and medicine, Israel has continued to refuse to allow in heavy machinery, tents, and housing caravans as it agreed to under the ceasefire terms. Speaking to the Turkish Anadolu news agency, Salama Maruf of the government media office said that Gaza requires 200,000 tents, but only about half of that number had been delivered before the closures. Only 15 mobile homes have entered Gaza, he added, while 60,000 are needed to accommodate displaced families. Officials in the Palestinian health sector, as well as international aid organizations in Gaza, warn that if the closures remain in effect and if the ceasefire does not hold, there will be devastating consequences for Palestinians struggling to survive. The International Rescue Committee says it has gathered 6.7 tons of much-needed pharmaceutical and medical supplies for hospitals in Gaza, which was due to arrive this week but is now blocked by Israel. The aid organization Islamic Relief warned that, quote, a return to the relentless horror and atrocities that we saw for more than 15 months would be a global failure of staggering proportions. The UK group Medical Aid for Palestinians stated that, quote, a year ago, the International Court of Justice ordered measures to prevent genocide in Gaza, but by again blocking aid, Israel continues to violate them. Its return to total siege should be resolutely condemned by the international community, including the UK government, which must now take immediate action to ensure aid access is fully restored and international law is enforced. Mohammed Al-Khatib, the group's deputy director of programs in Gaza, said, quote, it is a continuation of the mockery of humanity and double standards toward the civilian population of the Gaza Strip, and the world is still standing by, watching. John will have much more on Israel's ceasefire violations later on in this broadcast. Clean water remains in critical shortages across Gaza. This week, the municipality of Deir al-Balah in central Gaza announced that its 2 desalinization plants have stopped working due to the lack of fuel to run the electricity generators. Journalist and researcher Maha Husseini of the Euromed Human Rights Monitor reported from the dialysis clinic at Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza City on Wednesday, where she said, quote, all machines have suddenly stopped working due to a lack of water. The machines have been shut down for the day and patients were sent home until the water tanks are refilled. Israel has destroyed around 90% of Gaza's water wells and 80% of its water infrastructure, making access to water a daily struggle for both individuals and hospitals, she added. Here's that video. That's from Maha Husseini. We've published many features on the Electronic Intifada in the last week, but we wanted to highlight excerpts of In Gaza's Ruins, A Different Kind of War by Abdullah Yunus, writing from Gaza. Abdullah profiles several families living in unsafe conditions as Netanyahu shut the crossings once more. He writes that, quote, after 15 months of forced displacement, Mutassim Zahed and his family were able to return to their home in Jabalia in northern Gaza. The family of 6 had endured more than a year of relentless Israeli attacks, but the ceasefire that allowed for the family's return to their badly damaged home did not mean that their struggle for survival was over. The widespread destruction wrought by Israel and the lack of essential infrastructure and insufficient humanitarian assistance has left Palestinians in Gaza like 𝐓𝐡𝐞 and his family, feeling they are now enduring a different kind of war. When 𝐓𝐡𝐞, 53 years old, returned to his home, he found that the walls had collapsed and the ceiling was cracked. It was no longer suitable for him and his family. After they could not find a tent or a shelter center to receive them, 𝐓𝐡𝐞 said that their only option was to try to repair part of their dilapidated home using wood and nylon sheeting. We sleep in fear that the ceiling will collapse on our heads at any moment, but it is still better than staying in the street, 𝐓𝐡𝐞 told the Electronic Intifada. At night, the family remains alert for any noises that might indicate structural failure. We no longer know which is more dangerous, staying under this cracked ceiling or going out into the open without shelter, 𝐓𝐡𝐞 said. With basic infrastructure in the area destroyed, 𝐓𝐡𝐞 is forced to walk for hours in search of any working water well. He often returns with a small bucket that is not enough to meet the family's needs for one day. We live on drops of water, and we wash our faces with an amount that is not enough for a child, he said. 𝐓𝐡𝐞, 𝐓𝐡𝐞's wife, pointed to Israel's deliberate manufacturing of the catastrophic conditions their family is being subjected to. We feel like we are living inside a time bomb that could collapse on us at any moment, she said, referring to the family's severely damaged home. Why does Israel not allow the entry of caravans and tents into the Strip as stipulated in the ceasefire agreement? That is an excerpt from Abdullah Yunus's feature In Gaza's Ruins, A Different Kind of War on electronicintifada.net. Turning to the occupied West Bank, our contributor Zeina El-Tahan writes about Israel's military assault on the Al-Farah refugee camp in the northern occupied West Bank, part of a wider and ongoing string of attacks that began in mid-January in the Jenin, Nablus, and Tulkarem areas. Zeina writes that at least 60 Palestinians have been killed and dozens more wounded across the northern West Bank since the start of the operation. Some 40,000 Palestinians have been forced from their homes, with the Jenin, Tulkarem, and Nur Shams refugee camps almost completely emptied. She adds that Israeli soldiers occupied Palestinian homes in Al-Farah camp and used them as military outposts during their 11-day assault last month, leaving behind feces, urine, and used condoms. Fida Abu Zaina's home was one of them. Abu Zaina, 46, his wife and 3 children were forced out at gunpoint on February 2nd, the first day of the assault. Given their home's location at the entrance to the camp, theirs was the first case of expulsion. Using his home as a military outpost, soldiers lived, slept, and ate in Abu Zaina's home for 11 days, during which they vandalized it beyond recognition, leaving a stench of urine and feces and used condoms on the floor and in the closets. Quote, I lost my mind when I saw the inside of my home for the first time after they withdrew. It's a garbage dump. It's uninhabitable. There's no home anymore. Abu Zaina, a former welder, told the Electronic Intifada from his bare living room, which he had to empty of all the furniture that had been ruined by soldiers. They told us we had 5 minutes to grab our belongings and leave and to come back a month later, Abu Zaina said. The soldiers tried to force us to leave the camp, but I refused. I told them they can bomb my house and me along with it. In the end, they let me go to my father's house in another part of the camp. Israel's current assault is the longest in the occupied West Bank in more than 2 decades, and it is the largest operation of forcible displacement there since 1967. This video shows Israeli military vehicles rampaging through the streets of Jenin on March 4th. The Palestinian rights group Al-Haq said that the entire city of Jenin was completely sealed off, with all entrances and exits blocked on day 43 of the large-scale Israeli military assault. Israeli occupying forces launched their 3rd phase of their attack on Jenin, sending in a large number of military vehicles, including 10 Eitan armored carriers, Apache helicopter gunships, and reconnaissance drones, Al-Haq said. Read Zaina Al-Tahan's report, Israeli Soldiers Vandalize and Desecrate West Bank Homes on electronicintifada.net for much more. Meanwhile, Defense for Children International Palestine reports that 2 weeks after Israeli forces arrested and detained a 14-year-old child from his home in Beit Fajar, south of Bethlehem, during a pre-dawn raid, a 4-month administrative detention order was issued against him this week. Mouin Ghassan Fahed Salahat, the group says, is the youngest Palestinian child placed under an administrative detention order since DCIP began monitoring child administrative detainees in 2008. Israeli soldiers forcibly entered Mouin's home at 3:40 in the morning on February 19th, DCIP states. Mouin's father was immediately detained, blindfolded, and restrained with his hands behind his back. When Mouin awoke and went to find his father, Israeli soldiers seized him and began searching the house. The family was not given an arrest warrant and were told not to move, while soldiers damaged their belongings and confiscated phones and a computer. The soldiers attempted to blindfold Mouin and tie his hands behind his back as they took him away. Afterward, a soldier warned Mouin's father not to move for at least 10 minutes. Administrative detention violates fundamental due process rights, yet Israeli forces are now expanding this draconian policy to detain Palestinian children indefinitely without charge or trial, said Ayed Abu Aktesh, Accountability Program Director at DCIP. Mouin's case sets a dangerous precedent showing that no Palestinian child, regardless of age, is safe from arbitrary imprisonment under Israel's military rule, he added. Mouin, a 9th grade student and the only child in his family, has been placed under administrative detention, a practice in which Israeli authorities detain Palestinians, including children, without charge or trial based on secret evidence that neither the detainee nor their lawyer can review. Israeli forces are holding 112 Palestinian children in administrative detention as of December 31st, 2024, according to information shared by the Israel Prison Service, the highest number of child detainees since DCIP began monitoring this number in 2008. Finally, as we always do, we wanted to share images of people expressing determination and resilience across Palestine. In the occupied West Bank, Mohammed al-Maleh, who is in Israeli prison for 29 years and was recently released during a prisoner exchange, was able to finally be with his family and break their fast together on the first day of Ramadan. He says, quote, "Despite all the tragedies and circumstances that we live through on a daily basis, we always have the ability to find moments of joy, and this gathering is one of those moments." An older relative says that this Ramadan is special because their hero is back.
لكن رغم كل هذه الظروف وكل هذه المآسي اللي بنعيشها بشكل يومي، دائما عندنا القدرة ان احنا خلينا نقول نسرق لحظات فرح، وبعتقد هذه الجمعة هي واحدة من هذه اللحظات.
And in Gaza, amongst the rubble in Rafah, dining tables were lined up as far as the eye can see, preparing for an iftar meal. And that's it for the news roundup. As always, go to electronicintifada.net for much more, especially to read our new features by our brave writers in Gaza. You're watching the Electronic Intifada live stream. I'm Nora Barrows-Friedman with my colleague, Ali Abunimah. Hi, Ali.
Hi, Nora. Thank you for that news briefing. And
Yes.
the bottom line is that Israel is once again openly announcing its intention to starve more than 2 million people, that it's subjected to genocide for 16 months.
Yep.
And I just checked a short time ago, this is not on the front page of the New York Times. It's not on the front page of the BBC. It's not on the front page of the Washington Post. It's not on the front page of the CBC. And to their credit, CNN has a tiny, tiny mention of it on its front page right now. And that's why we're here week after week.
Yeah. And in fact, they manufactured consent for the closures last week when Israel and Israeli officials were claiming that Hamas wanted to break the ceasefire, that Hamas didn't want to move, through the stages, when actually it was the absolute complete opposite. When Netanyahu said that what he wanted to do was force Hamas to extend phase one, while completely changing the terms. They wanted all of the Israeli captives back immediately without any of the conditions that were laid out at the end of phase one and into phase two. So, it's just, you can see this happening. You can see the gears turning. And the fact that, this acceleration of the siege, the fact that Israel can, at its whim, turn off the humanitarian aid, while claiming that it does no such thing. I mean, it's unconscionable, and it depends on the consent of the corporate mainstream media to back up those spurious lies and claims. So anyway, Jon will have a lot more coming up later about just what kind of violations of the ceasefire Israel has engaged in. But we have an extremely packed show for our audience today. So let's bring on our first guest.
Yes. And just a reminder, you're watching and listening to the Electronic Intifada live stream, and I'm Ali Abu Ni'mah here with my colleague Nora Barrows-Friedman. Last week, DAWN, a US-based human rights group, filed a 172-page brief with the International Criminal Court in The Hague, urging its chief prosecutor, 𝐓𝐡𝐞 𝐄𝐥𝐞𝐜, to investigate former US President Joe Biden, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin for their accessorial roles in aiding and abetting and intentionally contributing to Israeli war crimes and crimes against humanity during the genocide in Gaza. In an article in The Nation this week, Leah Whitson, the executive director of DAWN, writes, quote, "The court has already charged the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant for committing these same crimes. Seeking the prosecution of US officials in the only global criminal court was not a decision we took lightly, particularly as the court faces threats from the United States itself." Leah Whitson previously served as director of the Middle East and North Africa division of Human Rights Watch. She's now the executive director of DAWN, a group that was founded by Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi dissident who was murdered inside his country's own consulate in Istanbul in 2018. Sarah joins us now. Sarah, welcome to the Electronic Intifada live stream.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, Sarah. Good to see you.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. Before we talk about DAWN's submission to the ICC and the investigation of Joe Biden, I just want to get your reaction to the news that broke in the last day about the United States engaging in direct talks with Hamas as efforts to try to get the ceasefire to the next phase go on. Of course, Trump's latest belligerent threats against people in Gaza. What's your quick reading of these developments?
Well, if they're true, I think it's a welcome development because it's frankly stupid and crazy to try to resolve a military conflict without talking to all sides of the conflict. And given that Hamas is obviously one side of the most recent fighting that took place, it makes sense to talk to Hamas, given that they are the ones who are agreeing with Israel to certain conditions for a ceasefire, to certain exchanges tied to a ceasefire, then it makes sense to communicate directly with them. To be honest, I would be surprised if, in fact, the Biden administration had no direct communications with them or used kind of a fig leaf of intermediaries to pretend they weren't directly communicating with them. But the idea of a prohibition on speaking to a party to the conflict when you're trying to negotiate a solution is pretty stupid. So I hope it's true.
Yeah.
Great. And we'll be talking more about that later in the show. But in your article in The Nation, you state that you and your colleagues did not take the decision lightly to ask the ICC to investigate Joe Biden and other members of his administration. What did you have to consider, and why did you ultimately take this step? I'm sure lots of people are saying we should just focus on Trump. Why even worry about Biden now?
Well, it's actually multi-layered. There were multi-layered concerns, and making the decision to proceed with this submission and to publicize the submission was probably one of the most difficult ones I've had to make as a human rights lawyer, as a human rights activist of many decades. There were a few people, in all honesty, who didn't want us to, or advised against making any submission against U.S. officials, for fear that it would basically weaken the ICC, increase the ammunition against the ICC, and thereby weaken the existing case against Israeli officials. And the idea was, let's go horizontal on liability. Let's add more Israeli culprits. We, of course, DAWN was the first to submit for investigation 43 Israeli defense officials, defense members of the IDF forces who were engaged in war crimes in Gaza. So we had already done that. But the idea was to add more. And I think it just boiled down to whether or not we would be doing more harm than good with this submission. There was particularly concern because of the pending bill in Congress, which came to a vote in late January, that would have imposed much worse sanctions as a matter of law, as opposed to a mere executive order, which is more easily kind of extinguished, that would sanction the court. And we didn't want publicity around our submission to actually help that vote pass. It was narrowly defeated in a filibuster. It was surprisingly defeated in a filibuster. We were pretty certain, senators were pretty certain that it was going to pass. And it didn't pass. It may come back. It's likely to come back. But at least we hope that we won't be blamed for the passage of that law, sort of adding fuel to the fire of those who want the ICC attacked, but would now have a fresh excuse to attack the ICC by saying, see, now they're going after US officials. So, and then finally, of course, was the legal liability that our organization or our staff, including myself, could be facing for doing something that breached the new executive order that Trump did issue about providing material support to a sanctioned entity or an individual. And now Karim Khan has been sanctioned by the Trump administration. I think we fortunately avoided that by making our submission privately, quietly, in January before the sanctions were issued, but publicizing it after the vote was defeated and the sanctions had already been passed. So, having to maneuver around these legal attacks on the court and the prospect of legal attacks on the court was, of great concern. And, we really were focused on what is likely to contribute to justice for the Palestinian victims and not deter from justice for Palestinian victims. And, we also consulted with at least half a dozen, if not a dozen, ICC law experts on aiding and abetting liability, on sort of strategic considerations of this kind of a submission, given the pressure the prosecutors under. And there were definitely varying opinions, but net, the decision was to proceed, and hence we did proceed.
Well, tell us a little bit more about what you're asking the ICC to do, and what type of evidence you've gathered about Biden and Blinken and Austin. And does the International Criminal Court have a jurisdiction to act against former officials of the United States, which is, now, as you said, not a member of the ICC?
Several questions there. Let me. Now I'm not even remembering what the first one was, but
what you're asking the court to do,
yeah. So we are asking the court under something that's called an Article 15 communication. Article 15 of the Rome Statute allows basically anyone in the world to communicate with the court, to communicate with the prosecutor, to share evidence and information, make suggestions and recommendations, and that's typically that is the vehicle through which victims or civil society groups submit evidence and information to the court, and they do significantly rely on this evidence and information, because their own investigative abilities are obviously very limited, particularly in Israel-Palestine, because Israel won't allow the court's investigators to go to Gaza or to the West Bank or to Israel in order to complete their firsthand investigations, but others are able to do that. So our submission, our Article 15 submission, urges the court to investigate these 3 U.S. officials in particular, but then I think we have about 10 additional U.S. officials who we believe bear some inquiry as well. But with these 3 officials, specifically to investigate them and we hope prosecute them for violating the Rome Statute, Article 25, prohibition on aiding and abetting crimes in the Rome Statute, or facilitating the commission of crimes identified as crimes in the Rome Statute. And the evidence for the role that these U.S. officials played under the sort of jurisprudence and jurisprudential requirements of the International Court of how you prove aiding and abetting liability. It's a very high standard in the ICC. It's a very high bar. Mere knowledge that crimes are being committed is, and then providing assistance is not sufficient. There has to be direct action to assist in the commission of crimes or to facilitate the commission of crimes. And there has to be knowledge that this support will be used to facilitate the crimes. That is where we find intent, and we can deduce intent from, in addition to actual statements that they've made expressing their intent to support Israel in the commission of its crimes. So with these 3 officials, the evidence of these actions and intent was actually not difficult to show or to prove. Nor was it difficult to show or prove that the assistance that they secured for Israel, which we include military support, political support, and public support, all played an essential role and provided essential contribution to facilitate the commission of the crimes. So the support that they authorized specifically as individuals includes not only the transfer of nearly $20 billion in military aid, and this military aid is military aid that Israeli officials and U.S. officials have repeatedly admitted is essential to Israel to commit its crimes, that it could not carry out its military operations without such U.S. support, including intelligence support. But it also includes the political support, namely, in particular, most significantly, the 7 UN vetoes and abstentions that President Biden ordered Ambassador Thomas Greenfield, Thomas, I always switch the name of her name.
Linda Thomas Greenfield.
Linda Thomas Greenfield to make that specifically was with the purpose of prohibiting the UN Security Council from imposing a ceasefire in order to ensure that Israel could continue with its crimes.
And you Sarah, show in the submission, the 172-page submission, which I read when I wrote about this for the Electronic Intifada, you actually cite statements from Joe Biden himself, which show that as he was ordering and as Secretary Blinken and Secretary Lloyd Austin were facilitating the arms transfers of including these 2,000-pound bombs, that Biden stated publicly that he knew that Israel was bombing Gaza indiscriminately. He used the term indiscriminate bombing. From a legal standpoint, do those sorts of statements matter?
Well, they matter a great deal. Intent is probably the hardest thing to show in international law, because basically you need the person to verbally declare their intention, which smarter war criminals avoid doing, and instead, mask their language more carefully to make platitudes about protecting civilians. And a lot of the writings of the U.S. government is phrased in that kind of terminology, avoiding saying that Israel's violating the law, instead saying inane things like, we want to encourage Israel to do more to comply with the law, just ridiculous things. But occasionally, regularly and repeatedly, these kinds of acknowledgments did slip out from their mouths, again, indicating very clearly that they knew U.S. weapons were being used to commit crimes, and having every reason to know that those crimes would continue. In addition, there is the extensive advice of their own staff, making them aware, not just in the State Department, but also the Defense Department, making them aware that the weapons were being used in violation of U.S. laws, making them aware that they were being used to commit crimes and atrocities. And despite the advice from their own staff, these three men intervened and interfered to ensure the largely unimpeded flow of weapons and political support to Israel, and played a critical and essential role in facilitating the crimes.
And you call this, in your submission, you refer to what's happening in Gaza as genocide. But the International Criminal Court has not indicted Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant with genocide, but with war crimes and crimes against humanity, which include all sorts of horrific crimes that are part of genocide. But genocide has that extra element of intent. Are you calling for the ICC to investigate Joe Biden as an accomplice in genocide?
Yes, I mean, we absolutely are. I believe the charges against the Israelis, against the Israeli officials, Netanyahu and Gallant, who against whom arrest warrants were issued, did include a charge of genocide, but that the indictment was limited to a narrower set of crimes. Those can be added on. Additional arrest warrants could be issued for additional crimes. The court has already indicated that there are additional arrest warrants coming out. There's no limitation on, the ability of the court to add on additional crimes as circumstances arise. We have presented what I believe is the evidence to substantiate that the charge of genocide by Israelis is accurate and correct, and that the role of U.S. officials in aiding and abetting that crime is as ample as the evidence of all of the other crimes under the Rome Statute that they have been charged with. DAWN in December of 2023, just the end of December 23, or early 24, I think, was the first organization to issue a report concluding that what's taking place in Gaza was genocide. And we reached that conclusion very quickly because the evidence is overwhelming, and it's not a numeric contest. It's a description of actions and intentions. You can, no one can die and you can find genocide, which actually recently happened in a finding of genocidal atrocities in Artsakh based purely on forced displacement. We had a convening with genocide scholars, Holocaust scholars, international law experts, human rights experts in Gaza and Palestine. And based on that convening and the papers presented there, we did reach the conclusion that what was taking place was genocide. And, that is the contribution we think that DAWN can make, sort of being able to chime in more quickly, if not as comprehensively as Amnesty subsequently did. But I hope we contributed to normalizing the legal understanding that a genocide is being committed.
Yeah. Finally, we just have a couple minutes left, Sarah. So far, we've seen leaders in countries that claim to strongly support the ICC, including Germany and Poland, openly flout it by suggesting that they would welcome Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu to visit them and not arrest him. You've been working in the human rights field for many years. Do you think that the ICC and other international institutions can really be vehicles for equal justice, or are they too compromised by political interference and pressure, especially from the U.S.?
I think they're in a somewhat of a damned if we do and damned if we don't situation right now, because as I've written, over many years, since the case was submitted to the ICC, since the Palestine case was submitted to the ICC, if the ICC fails to investigate, prosecute, indict, arrest Israeli war criminals for what has been taking place since 2014, which is when the pending case goes back to, the ICC is dead. It will lose all credibility, and member states, particularly African member states, there'll be a massive exodus from the ICC. It will be the straw that breaks the camel's back. We've already had numerous African member states complaining bitterly about the fact that the only people they've arrested and prosecuted successfully are Black Africans. And, there's just no way that it would be tolerable or acceptable or credible for the court to fail to prosecute basically anyone allied with the United States or Western powers. So if they fail to do this, if they do allow political interference in pursuing this case, the court is finished. The court is over. This is the test for the case, just like the test for so many other things in our country, whether it's free speech or freedom of association or freedom to protest. This is this is the case. Either you allow this or your protections don't mean anything. But now we see that for certain Western states like Germany, and obviously like the United States, they are willing to try to destroy the court if it takes on Israel. So this is really a question for the international community. Are you going to burn down the court because it's prosecuting Israeli war criminals? That's a test. And, if they are, then, the court was never worth its name anyway. So be it, but this is the test. This is the test for the court. I would say, impressed with the prosecutor and the fact that he did proceed despite the overwhelming pressure against him. I think he was much slower to act than I wish he was. I think he could have acted before the Gaza war on, the war crimes of settlements, for example. He had ample opportunity. But it is also important that when push has come to shove, he did act. He did seek additional backing for the issuance of the arrest warrants with this made-up advisory committee. That's okay. But now, of course, they're trying to bring him down with, drumming up allegations, personal allegations against him. But yeah, the survival of the International Criminal Court is on the line.
Well, thank you, Sarah. We are glad to see you pushing. I mean, people are skeptical of these institutions, I think, for good reason, but I think it's right to put them to the test. And if they fail, it won't be because people did not try to use them as they were intended. And we hope to have you come back and update us on what happens and perhaps other things DAWN is working on. And let's just remind people about DAWN's website. Where can they find out more about what you're doing?
Yeah, we are at dawnmena.org, MENA, and we have a newsletter. It comes out once a month. We don't bombard people too much with emails, so please do sign up. We broadly work to reform U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. So we work on Saudi Arabia, UAE, Jordan, Egypt, basically all the abusive dictatorships and apartheid regimes that our government supports. So.
US backed, yes.
US backed, yeah.
Important to point out. Thank you so much, Sarah, and we really appreciate you giving us some of your time today.
Great. Thank you,
Thanks,
guys,
Sarah.
for all your work. And
Thank
you
so much. Thanks. Oh, and
yeah,
yeah.
we can dream about seeing Joe Biden hauled off in shackles, but I think an important point we didn't get to in the discussion, of course, there's always so much more we can say, is that this is a point that Dawn makes in its materials, is that this is, of course, accountability is important, holding these individuals to account, but this is also about deterring future criminality when even US officials say that there is at least a potential for them to be held accountable in this way. So I'm glad to see this happening.
Yeah. As always, Palestine is the test. And kind of, holding that thread a little, let's move to our second segment about Palestine being the test and the exception, of course. You're watching and listening to the Electronic Intifada live stream. I'm Nora Barrows-Friedman with my colleague Ali Abunimah. Yesterday, March 5th, the U.S. Senate Committee for the Judiciary held hearings in Washington that called for what civil rights group Palestine Legal says are investigations into the First Amendment protected activities of university students who courageously organized for over 15 months to bring an end to Israel's genocide in Gaza. The Senate hearing Palestine Legal adds relies on the false conflation of support for Palestinian rights with anti-Semitism. This conflation allows for anti-Palestinian and anti-democratic actors to pretend to care about Jewish safety while they really silence advocates for Palestinian freedom. This comes on the heels of U.S. President Donald Trump's executive order targeting college students who participate in protests or speech activity that is critical of Israel's genocide, as well as his social media announcement on March 4th that, quote, illegal protests on college campuses will result in that university's loss of federal funding, expulsion or arrest of students, and that agitators on student visas will be deported. These measures are part of an expanding witch hunt of U.S. students organizing for Palestinian rights and the acceleration of university administrators' repression of their students at the service of pro-Israel donors and relationships with Israeli institutions. But students are not backing down to these bipartisan attacks on free speech and Palestinian rights. In New York City, students at Columbia University and Barnard College have been engaging in more than a week of sit-ins, protesting Barnard's decision to expel 3 students, one for allegedly protesting the university's investments in genocide and allegedly participating in the occupation of Hind's Hall last year, and 2 for allegedly disrupting a class on the history of modern Israel. Students say that these expulsions are the first of their kind since students engaged in anti-war protests in 1968. And they say that the first protest resulting in expulsion was in the 1930s when a student dared to criticize Columbia's ties to Nazi Germany. Last week, after a 6-hour standoff, the university finally conceded to the demand for a negotiation on the expulsions. However, just before the scheduled meeting, Columbia intermediaries attempted to change the terms and force students to stall negotiations. That same day, the U.S. Department of Justice announced a McCarthyite federal task force to quash anti-genocide protests by investigating 10 college campuses, including Columbia University. According to the announcement, Colombia was privately informed of the task force's impending visit just one day before Barnard expelled the third student. Students say that rather than engaging with them or divest, Barnard has rushed to satisfy the U.S. Department of Justice by sanctioning and expelling students. And yesterday, students held another sit-in protest at the campus library, which they renamed the Dr. Hussam Abu Safiya Liberation Zone in honor of the Palestinian pediatrician and head of the Kamal Adwan Hospital in Beit Lahia in northern Gaza, who was abducted by Israeli soldiers in December and remains in Israeli jail. Throngs of New York City police, which was tasked with, quote, managing the protest by the administration, arrested and assaulted students. Meanwhile, university administrators rolled out the red carpet to welcome former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, who spoke on campus at Columbia. And today, Thursday, he is due to speak at Harvard University in Boston. While Bennett, who famously boasted about murdering Palestinians while he was in the Israeli army, saying, quote, I've killed many Arabs in my life and there's no problem with that, is being given the red carpet treatment by the administrators of these elite U.S. institutions. Students are organizing protests in defense of Palestinian rights and risking their academic careers in order to do so. Here's a few seconds of footage of the protests in New York against Bennett's event yesterday.
Free, free Palestine! Free, free, free Palestine!
And we are happy to be joined now by two members of the Columbia University Apartheid Divest Group, which has been part of the Barnard sit-ins this week, to talk about the current state of repression on their campuses and where this movement goes from here. And they are coming to us as anonymous students. We will not share their name nor their image because of the level of repression by the administrators and the New York City Police Department against them right now. Both students, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
So tell us about the sit-ins. What happened yesterday and what you're demanding from the administration?
So yesterday was really a continuation of action that we've been performing since last week. This is obviously in response to the two expulsions that you mentioned, Nora, from the alleged classroom disruption of the history of modern Israel. And yesterday was I think, a really shocking and harrowing sight for all Columbia students. I mean, even you can see on Broadway, obviously the main street outside where the sit-in happens, you had it felt like the whole student body out there to watch, to chant, to support the students. And obviously the biggest event of the night was the bomb scare called in by the NYPD, which basically led them to call in all their SRG, their strategic response group units, and these massive vans and buses to clear out all the protesters from the main library at Barnard, which is called the Milstein Center. And because of this bomb scare, which the president of Barnard, Laura Rosenberry, said later was a very specific pipe bomb threat in Milstein, that they cleared off all the protesters and they made a perimeter even down the street, leading to the arrests of a few students and clearing out all the protesters outside of the Milstein Center. So it was a shocking sight for a lot of people. Personally, even watching it was a very scary experience.
And that bomb threat, which the university claimed came in, we don't know from where, but it was very convenient for sure. And Columbia University Students for Justice in Palestine posted this picture. Tamara, if we can put this up, which shows, and the caption of that was posted by SJP is, NYPD brought detained students into the library they claimed had to be cleared due to a bomb threat, while still supposedly investigating that bomb threat. So what does that tell you about the good faith or lack of it with which the administration is proceeding against students like yourselves, whose crime appears to be speaking out against genocide.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to say here, but I think if this was a genuine bomb threat, and there was actually a bomb in the Milstein Center, which that's the building you see in this picture right here, that's where the sit-in happened. If there actually was a bomb in that building, like you said, there are clear pictures of them taking the detainees and the arrested protesters into the building. And this is, keep in mind, simultaneously while they're moving all the protesters off to the left. So this is while they're moving it to make a perimeter around the building, yet here they are taking all these protesters into the building where their alleged bomb threat is. So if the bomb threat was real, there seems to be a lot of disparity and hypocrisy between responding to protesters in the area and then students and faculty. Also, if you look at other pictures and videos of the sit-in yesterday, you can see people leaning out of windows on the first and second floors recording, as on the ground floor there are protesters being pushed all the, like 2,000, 3,000 feet to the left. So for some reason, the bomb threat was only seen to be on the ground floor, and none of those people were cleared out. Not to
Might have just lost them.
difference in the response between protesters. And if it wasn't a bomb threat, it shows, just how far President Rosenberry and the NYPD and the Barnard admin are willing to go to clear out disruptions and protests.
Yes, go ahead. Number 2, student number 2.
Oh, sorry. Yes, everyone was told to shelter in place extremely conveniently, everyone else on campus, and there was no bomb squad or SWAT called in. It was SRG, which is infamously known for arresting protesters. So the idea of a bomb threat, whether it was true or false, endangered everyone, though, yeah, it's up to your interpretation.
Yeah. And of course, Columbia University said that they had tasked the NYPD with, quote, managing the protests. They didn't even acknowledge why there was a protest, of course. And can you talk about the Naftali Bennett speech and the timing of it, and what that signals to students and faculty who are trying to protect the rights of Palestinians and are being told that they are possibly engaging in criminal behavior by exercising their right of free speech and academic freedom to protest someone like Naftali Bennett, who boasts about his war crimes, who, has a record that is horrifying if you study, anything about international human rights law or Palestine in general. Can you talk about the timing of the administration rolling out the red carpet for someone like Naftali Bennett?
Yeah, I can take this. I think seeing as how 𝐓𝐡𝐞, especially the dean of 𝐓𝐡𝐞, Karen, she is known for being extremely supportive of the IOF. And I think a lot of
that's the School of International and Public Affairs. And, and you're talking about her support for the IOF, you mean Israeli occupation forces?
Yes, that's correct. So on that day, every part of campus was closed down except one. Cops were called in. SRG was called in at 4 p.m. We couldn't access food, housing. Everything had to go around to 116th and Broadway, constantly calling protesters the danger. Outside agitators are the danger to campus. But in Rosenberry's email to everyone, for some reason, a group of protesters were more of a danger than a bomb threat, over and over again. Someone who brags about killing Arab people is less of a danger than students.
Talk about the general atmosphere for students on campus in the sense of, I hear from friends at Columbia that the campus is constantly under lockdown. You are speaking to us anonymously. Students who are taking part in protests are covering their faces, disguising their identities. I mean, what has brought us to this level of if this was happening in another country, what would U.S.-based human rights groups or U.S.-based officials be saying about this? How do you understand the situation we're in?
I think it's extremely clear that they will do anything. They will inflict violence upon us. They will destroy our relationship with our neighborhood and our community members who cannot access the subway, who cannot enter campus, massive entire city blocks that they are supposed to be using under law. They will do all of this to protect their donations from Zionist donors, to squash all protests for Palestine, to just keep things in order. But it's actually incredible because right now we're having a rally, and the bravery of my comrades is extremely inspiring. Like the fact that we were able to pull off a sit-in last week and this week, people aren't scared. People, when one person's expelled, 100 more will rise up. I truly believe that, and it's happening.
Can you talk about the U.S. Department of Justice's so-called Task Force on Anti-Semitism and the significance of Columbia University's capitulation to the government's announcement that it will investigate these universities ostensibly over Palestine rights activism? How are students organizing? What kind of preparations have you made? And have you been able to talk with administrators about the what this will mean for students exercising their rights to protest?
Sure, yeah. This has definitely been very top of mind to both us at Quad, Columbia University, Apartheid Divest, and the administration. We've seen that repeatedly in the emails and communications they've sent out to us. There's this since the announcement of the task force and government investigations, there has been stronger language about, using quote unquote whatever means necessary, or crack down on these quote unquote outside agitators, or like this attempt to like belittle us to some sort of like small fringe community, even though literally yesterday there was the Student Government Authority of Barnard, which obviously represents the student body, issued a very strong email and statement to the administration saying, essentially, this is ridiculous, and how have you promised us never to bring on the NYPD, and you went and broke this promise. So this is very clearly top of mind for them, is that they feel this pressure of, the DOJ and Trump and the federal government looming behind them, and they're trying to respond more harshly to us, I think, in an attempt to, acquiesce to that pressure. But this has really failed, because yesterday, even after the sit-in, the President Rosenberry, the president of Barnard, reached out, agreeing to a meeting. And obviously now we're in, current discussion and internal communication about how we're going to approach that, whether we're going to take it, what conditions, etc. But still, the fact of the matter is that they're trying to crack down on us, but they can't stand in the face of the entire student body being against divestment, being against their expulsions, the NYPD, and all of this. So yes, definitely top of mind, but I think our, like my colleague mentioned, it's very inspiring to see just how much we'll rally together against that.
Yeah.
And just very recently, 𝐄𝐥𝐞 𝐄𝐥𝐿, Israel's education minister, met with Columbia University's president, Katrina Armstrong, reportedly to discuss campus anti-Semitism and strengthening U.S.-Israel research ties. And just last week, former CIA director and U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who of course was in the first Trump administration and is a very far-right supporter of Israel, announced that he's joining the faculty at Columbia. He joins such other illustrious figures on the faculty as Hillary Clinton. What does this tell us? I mean, is the university just doubling down on its efforts to placate Israel and its supporters while throwing its own students under the bus? What do you think is driving all this? You already mentioned an interest in appeasing donors, but also put this in a broader context for us in terms of what you see happening at other universities. For example, at Harvard, where Naftali Bennett is scheduled to speak as well, and with various universities officially adopting the Israel lobby's definition of anti-Semitism. I don't know who wants to take that. Either of you could take that.
Nope. Maybe neither.
Give me 1 second. Let me.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. I think they're also doing a lot of organizing as they're speaking to us, because the sit-ins, the protests haven't stopped.
Yeah, they're ongoing, and
Yeah.
you know, they were ongoing late into the evening yesterday, with the NYPD being called in yet again. I
Yeah.
mean, just
Yeah.
now the universities are calling the cops on their own students. It's absolutely
Yeah. That's
incredible.
unconscionable.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, I think. Okay, so I think there's definitely a lot, like we mentioned, about donors and external pressure, external Zionist pressure. I mean, there's a lot of, I'm sure you guys have picked this up, but there have been a lot of leaked group chat pictures coming out of Columbia students and alumni, you know, working together to specifically target, this is obviously following the Trump orders, students here on visas that are protesting in the pro-Palestine protests to try to deport them. So I think there's a lot of external pressure, you know, working with students or alumni or faculty to go after these protests. I mean, if you read in the leaked group chat pictures, there was I you know, vividly remember one person in the group chat who mentioned that they ran like a finance firm, a private equity firm in New York, and how he was independently meeting with the Columbia endowment committee or board, or whoever was in charge of it, to put pressure on them, like basically completely in the private sector, but put pressure on them to not give up to divestment and you know, other similar demands that we're making. So you know, that does seem daunting for many.
And I think, just sorry to interrupt, I think you're also referring, there was some reporting in the Tamara, in the Intercept. Tamara, I just put that in the StreamYard chat last month about these WhatsApp groups of well-connected people, major donors, billionaires, and so on, using these chat groups to really plot against students and faculty at Columbia who support Palestinian rights.
Yeah, I also want to mention that I think as big as outside pressure is in terms of donors and alumni, the university itself this isn't antithetical, like squashing advocacy for Palestine isn't antithetical to what this university is about. Like, this university is founded on slavery, on extraction, on separating who gets access to it versus the community that it extracts from. Like, we are studying Western masterpieces of art and music and philosophy and history. This isn't about this. It talks about being a global university, but it's always going to prop up imperialism because that is what sustains it.
Mm-hmm. Well, finally, can you talk about where these protests go from here, and advice to other students? You know, I mean, here in California, the so-called task force is coming to, quote, investigate UC Berkeley over the same claims, you know, that are being levied against Columbia and Barnard students. What advice do you have? What has sustained your protest this far? And you know, what do you think students should be preparing for?
My advice to other students would be to be brave and rely on each other. I think one of the amazing things that we have going for us is that we have collective defense. So we are committed to taking care of one another. And we know that when one of us is in jail, all of us are not free yet. So things like protecting each other at jail support and with discipline, like making sure we are prepared, but also the fact that I am scared, we are scared. This isn't this isn't it's dangerous. There's violence on our campuses. It's dangerous to be participating in a sense, but also we have a duty to Palestine. We have a duty to make sure that our money is not going towards bombing people always.
Yeah, and to bounce off of that, we make a very proactive effort to always ground ourselves in what's happening on the floor in Palestine. In every single one of our meetings, our rallies, protests, actions will always start with a PAL update, Palestine news update of what's going on the ground. Even, our decision to name the sit-in yesterday after Dr. Hassan al-Safiya, like this is so intentional to force big media that pick up this sit-in to talk about, obviously he is still currently going through this problem. He's still currently incarcerated, but even Hinz Hall last year, to force media to pick up and talk about the martyrs in Palestine. So, to keep ourselves grounded in the horrors and atrocities of what's happening in Palestine, and to keep that perspective has really pushed our movement as a community collectively together and given us that inspiration and also humility to keep fighting in the face of all this pressure and terror tactics of the administration and NYPD and outside forces.
Yeah. And just also a reminder that groups like Palestine Legal, the ACLU, Center for Constitutional Rights, which is based in New York City, FIRE, there are all of these civil rights groups that are working with students every day to protect their rights to free speech and academic freedom, to remind administrations that free speech is still a thing, no matter if, a self-described task force comes to, investigate students, that there is still protections that students are afforded. And so just always a shout out to Palestine Legal and those other civil rights groups for legal advice, for protection. Anything else you want to say about the protests and how people can learn more and support?
I would say to find people in your community who are organizing. Like in every community, you start extremely small and you go to actions with them. You read, you have mutual aid events, you tap in where you can, at what you're good at. And in that way, everyone has something to contribute. And reading about Palestine, not focusing on so much on student protesters who are getting arrested, which is important, but also it's a fraction of what's happening and what we're fighting for.
Well said. All right. Thank you both, Columbia University Student 1 and Student 2, both members of Columbia University Apartheid Divest. Keep us posted. Of course, we'll be watching, and we hope to have you both back on as soon as possible. Thanks so much.
And please know, and please let your comrades know that you have the support of people all over the country and all over the world. And you are voices of conscience in a world that too often people are not willing to put anything on the line the way you are. So we truly thank you for what you're doing.
Yeah.
Thank you guys so
Students
much.
are the vanguard.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Oh, well, I'm glad we got them.
I am too, and how sad that in the United States, where Donald Trump claimed that free speech is back, students don't feel safe enough to speak publicly about something like genocide. It's just shocking to me, and that the university administrators are entirely complicit in this. And one thing I want to say to our viewers who are alumni of various colleges or universities, including some of the ones we've mentioned, is a lot of this pressure is coming from alumni and donors who support genocide and who support Israel. And so we can also put counter pressure on. So pay attention to what is happening at your alma mater. If you have been to one of these universities that is repressing student activists, and maybe write to the president, write to the alumni relations office, and make your own voice heard and tell them that you object to them repressing the voices of students speaking out against genocide. I think that's another thing that many of us can do to support them.
Well, thank you. Yeah, just it's just unconscionable to see once again the administration of Colombia invite the cops, the NYPD, that has a budget of a small country, on to violently attack and intimidate and abuse their students, who, as you say, are just trying to oppose genocide and oppose their university's ties and complicity with the genocide. So we'll have much more on that. Of course, that's a story we're going to keep following. Before we go to John, we have a very special guest, live from Gaza, Abubaker Abed, our contributor. Are you there, Abubaker?
Hello.
Yes, there he is.
Hello,
Hi.
Abubaker. How are you?
Yeah, I'm really good. I thought I should have hidden my name and hidden my camera like the other guests.
Well, we worry about you too all the time, and we always hope and pray that you're safe. But it's good to see you, Abubaker, and Ramadan Kareem to you, and Ramadan Kareem to all of our viewers who are observing Ramadan. And tell us how you're doing and how things are in Gaza. The news has been very worrying. Of course, it's always been difficult, as you make so clear in your reporting, but the last few days with Israel announcing the cutoff of aid again, and the comments from Donald Trump, which I know you saw and tweeted about, with really horrible threats. What's going on around you? What's the mood? How are people reacting to all of these events?
So the violations are still ongoing, unfortunately. And just like moments ago, the Israelis are still firing at people's homes in Rafah, the southernmost part of the Strip. And this has gone on for a very long time since the ceasefire took effect. And it seems like Rafah is out of the ceasefire deal framework that has been signed on January the 19th. At least 60 people have been killed there since the ceasefire took hold, and there are still many injuries. And this is apart from the fact that Rafah is filled and littered with unexploded ordnances, and those ordinances have caused many casualties over the course of the past weeks. And not only this, because earlier today, a drone strike on the government civilians in East Shajaiya neighborhood has killed one and injured many others. This is just one outright violation added to more than 350 from Israel. And Israel has not adhered to by the humanitarian protocol and not the ceasefire deal as well. And not only this, because we need to remind people that Hamas, although Israel has killed over 100 people since the ceasefire, Hamas has not fight back at all and has completely been committed to the ceasefire deal. And Hamas is just saying that it wants this war to end. However, Israel is going against that. Now, regarding Trump and what people are saying, people know that the will of the Palestinians is unbreakable. That's what they know, and that's what we know. Because again, what Israel has been doing for the past 16 months, from genociding people, exterminating entire neighborhoods, entire families, and wiping out entire neighborhoods, hasn't paid off at all in taking Palestinians out of Gaza. And this has been the clear ethnic cleansing plan was scheme from the start of the war, not even when Trump said or stated his ultimatum. This was from the start of this war. However, Palestinians stuck to their land. Palestinians remained steadfast and resilient in the face of extreme adversity and in the face of those horrors, and they are just vowing to themselves that they will stay no matter what. They know. I've been speaking to many people, Charlie and Nora, and they have told me whatever though I'm given outside Gaza, I will not leave because I know there is no peace, there is no calm. Calm was created in Gaza, peace was created in Gaza, and that's how we want it. Despite the fact that Gaza is now a desolate landscape, we know that, and it's a very devastated, just demolition site. It's a demolition site. We know that, but Palestinians know that they can rebuild that. They have a hope for the future that this land will become the most luxurious land in the world. That's what their hope. That's exactly their hope. And they want to make that very inevitably possible. That's what they want. That's their very, very, very goal. And then when it comes to all the destruction, the will of the Palestinians, the backbone that they have been instilled into, can really change things. And no matter what Trump says, because he has even before threatened Hamas in Gaza, saying that he will take out all Gazans out of the strip. However, he did not do anything, and then the ceasefire was continued, and 3 Israeli captives were released, and Palestinian hostages were also released from Israeli jails. So everything went very well. So we don't think that something will happen, and we will know here that we will die here no matter what. Like I will have like ending up in a grave, like simple. I can put it into simple words that ending up in a grave inside Gaza is better than having a castle elsewhere across the globe. That is literally the saying by every Palestinian, from the children to the elderly, inside the Palestinian enclave.
Abubaker, what can you say about the impact that you're seeing on the ground of now 5 straight days of strict closures on humanitarian aid by Israel? How are people coping? What are you seeing? How is this impacting everyday life?
I think, look, I cannot really conceal the fact that people do not have the means to blot out all the pain that they have been through. I understand that. And I understand that the current situation is still deteriorating every single day, particularly since Israel has imposed more restrictions on the crossing, the only crossing through which aid and commodities into Gaza. Now, we are seeing Gaza's markets running out of food. We're seeing the overpricing just running back again in Gaza. We're seeing people very extremely frustrated by this horrific act of heinous act by the Israelis that they have cut off this, because Israel wants to use this as leverage in the negotiations in an attempt to pressure Hamas to accept the ceasefire deal and the proposal that Israel wants to have, which is against not only Hamas, because there is no military context here. It is not only about this. It's not only about that Hamas wants this. It's also about the Palestinians. They want their land to be back. They want Gaza to be reconstructed again. The homes, the neighborhoods, the memories that have been wiped out and erased from the face of the earth during the last 14 months. Now, what they want and what they are desiring is to beautify Gaza again. That's what they want. Now, given the circumstances, Israel is quite it's literally ignorant, and the US administration is the same. The Palestinians went through 2 starvations before during the genocide in October 2024 and earlier in the same year in January and February. Palestinians, did they surrender? They of course did not. Did they really did their hope, or were the hopes dashed? Of course not. And they stuck together, they remained united in the face of all this terror, and they whatever is available in Gaza is better than anything they would have elsewhere across the globe. So that's what Palestinians are saying. That's what Palestinians have been built on. That's their mentality. That's how they are thinking and taking things at the moment. And you can see the young generations, particularly children who are still carrying water from afar. They are still jostling for food before the takeas, the free food distribution centers, and they are barefoot. They have only one piece of clothing on their bodies. They are shivering with cold and fear because the Israeli drones, while I'm talking to you, they are still buzzing very intensely overhead. But nonetheless, or despite all this, every Palestinian child wants to make their future just bright again, I met finally, just one final point I want to tell you, I met the youngest detainee in Gaza. He is just 17 years old. When I talked to him, he said, I was brutally assaulted and he was brutally tortured and very constantly. He was electrocuted multiple times, that he was on the cusp of death behind Israeli bars. He was even, his genitals were constantly touched and played with by Israeli female soldiers and male soldiers, and he was brutally and unfairly taken from Gaza, from his home Khan Yunis, during the Israeli incursion. Until now, one of the things that are still that is still striking me, Nora Dutali, is that he tells me that every day I get up in the morning looking at the sky, I'm very afraid that there is a fence above me and my hands are still, or I'm still handcuffed. So every single day, every morning when he gets up, he looks at his hands and he looks at the sky to make sure that he is still, or he is no longer inside the prison. Look at the trauma here. People cannot really deal with so much trauma. That's why I'm telling you that people do not have the means to blot out the pain, but they know that this pain can be erased by their hope and their love of life, and that's what Palestinians have shown and displayed to the entire world. So nothing will break us, and we will continue fighting until the very last moment. But again, it's not just about Gaza, it's about the liberation of every single piece of land in the occupied Palestinian territories, and we will continue that until the very last moment. Because I'm sorry, we have been let down by the whole international community, and no one is now saying a word against what Trump is saying, because everyone seems to be complicit and everyone seems to go against this population, this just tiny population of nearly 2 million people. Why? It's absolutely insanely unbearable, and it's absolutely absurd, disgraceful for everyone who's complicit in this. But we will continue fighting until the very, very last breath.
Abubaker, we know that your battery is running very low and we won't be able to talk to you for very long. So just before you go, I just want to ask you, this is now the second Ramadan during genocide. We saw some images of people celebrating, of people having a community iftar and suhoor, but just give us, what's your impression of how this Ramadan is in Gaza compared with last year, and just in terms of the atmosphere for people now?
I think the most important thing is that the bloodbath has stopped. So we're seeing no more killings. We're seeing, although we have seen that, to be honest, early in the morning one was killed, but it's not of the same scale that was happening during the genocide on the last Ramadan, April 20, or March and April 2024. Now, what is different is that people can move freely in the streets and very safely. They don't have anything to worry about. There's quite a slight improvement in the humanitarian situation. Gaza's markets are quite littered and filled with goods and commodities and people's needs, and things are now somewhat affordable for the entire population. However, many families that I personally know cannot really afford anything. They are without money, they are without their jobs, they are without shelters, they are without their homes, and they cannot really return to their homes because the Israeli military is still present there, and Israeli troops are surrounding the neighborhoods and devastated and destroyed neighborhoods. There is still pain in people's hearts to vent. There is still so much trauma to cover from, because 14 months of trauma that people have been through needs years to be removed or counseled or probably erased from their minds. So that's going to take a very long time. But people are trying to treat themselves and rehabilitate by the atmosphere that they are trying to make. Just an atmosphere, an ambience filled with joy and brimming with joy and beauty. We see in just Gaza's destroyed streets decorated and adorned by the lanterns, by the flags of Ramadan. We're seeing how people are absolutely amazing and strong, just taking or breaking their fast on the rubble of their homes. We're seeing how people are exchanging smiles, how people are reacting to this ceasefire, but they are still, to be honest, they are still quite afraid that this ceasefire might collapse. So their ultimate hope remains one thing, which is that they hope that this ceasefire will hold, because they cannot really that anymore. And that because of that, what they hope is that they can take a break from all the suffering that has been inflicted upon them, and from the grief, because they are still quite, stuck in the same cycle of displacement and grief, and that needs absolutely years until it can be ironed out. But Palestinians again do find beauty right now, even under the rubble. They are rising from the rubble, and I know they are gutted, but everything that has been gutted during the genocide is now taking a different shape because of the beautiful spirit of every Palestinian, from the young to the elderly, and we will make it beautiful with the gardens and with everything, and even the gardens, what we are seeing that people have started planting more plants like lettuce, like basil, like parsley, and other types of these green plants in a show of resilience and steadfastness and hope amid all this despair that is surrounding them, and that can be very hardly solved at the moment. So it's a very great time for every Palestinian, and we continue and continue and continue hoping and smiling like the first day when we talked.
Ramadan Kareem, Abubaker, we're so grateful for you. And, I saw that you are also posting pictures of your family's garden that is growing and blooming. And so I know that our audience always appreciates those updates on your...
Yeah,
Sorry?
we ate spinach. We ate spinach last time from the land itself, so it was more
Wow.
delicious than ever.
That's incredible. That's
Sure,
incredible.
sure it is. And we have so many people in the comments wishing you Ramadan Kareem, and saying how much they love you, and we all love you, Abubaker, and we always happy to see you, and we wish you and your family all the best, and come back anytime. We always love to see you. We
Inshallah.
doesn't feel like a real show without a chance to visit with you and hear from you. So we hope to always see you in good health and with that incredible smile.
I think inshallah next time, very hopeful that I will be instead of Nora, Nora will be instead of me.
Anytime you can take my place, Abubaker. This is your place. This chair is yours. Anytime.
Inshallah, in person, we'll see each other in person. Inshallah.
Yes.
All love and love from every single one here, and from my family to the EI, incredible and fantastic team, that terrific team.
Asim and Nabi, who we spoke to a few weeks ago, said he was waiting for me and Nora and Asa and Jon and the EI team to come to Gaza and eat fish by the sea. I think that's what we were going to do. So we'll all go do that together.
And you will be invited to Maftul, because we, Beit Daras, are the best makers of Maftul. So you're going to enjoy it. And bite your fingers after you tasting it. I promise.
We can't wait.
I can't wait.
And everyone in the audience is invited too. So
be careful. They might all come.
Absolutely, my home is theirs. I promise. My home is theirs.
Thank you so much,
Abubaker.
Abubaker.
Abubaker, and our love to your family, and we'll see you very soon.
Thank you for the work you do, the incredible work you do. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Oh, that smile.
Spirit.
Yeah.
Unbreakable spirit.
Yeah, just incredible.
Yeah.
Well, we still have about a ton more to get through today. Let's bring Jon on, and hi, Jon.
Hey guys, it's always great to see Abubaker.
Yeah.
Tough act to follow.
So tell us a little bit about what you're going to be covering today, and how it kind of fits into the context of what we've been talking about. You're also going to be talking about the various ceasefire violations.
Yes, and Abu Abed was just delivered a video message while we were on air So I got some notes from that, but I'm going to be covering the Nahal Oz raid on October 7th, which is something that we haven't done on the show because events overtook those days, and we never got a chance to break down those videos. And so the Israeli military is releasing their investigations into October 7th, and the Nahal Oz one was just released, and it matches up with the Qassam video. So I'm going to look at that from both perspectives.
Incredible.
Well,
all right.
Take it away, John.
Right. Thanks. Okay, so this is the resistance report for day 517 since October 7th. It's the ceasefire day 47. Like I said, I'm going to be reporting on the Israeli military investigations into the October 7th raid on the Nahal Oz military base. The Israeli military investigation was released on Monday, March the 3rd, and I am reporting this on Thursday, March the 6th. But first, I want to give an update of the ceasefire status. Phase 1 of the ceasefire expired, and Hamas released an itemized list of Israeli breaches of the deal. Sage 2 negotiations are not really begun. They're supposed to have begun early in phase 1. So we've known for a number of weeks now that this stage in between phase 1 and phase 2 was going to extend because the negotiations haven't been happening in earnest. So the Hamas document begins with violations related to the humanitarian relief shelter and relief and shelter protocols. Again, these are agreements signed and guaranteed. The guarantors of the agreement are the U.S., Egypt, Qatar, Israel, and the United Nations. So these are violations of the agreed upon stipulates in the ceasefire agreement. So the first one to note is a critical one. It is the failure to provide 50 fuel trucks a day. And of course, the 50 fuel trucks they have many knock-on impacts because fuel is needed for the power plants and for the desalination plants, and of course to run the heavy equipment to clear out the destruction in Gaza. So the lack of fuel is significant. Less than half have come in, 23 trucks per day, less than half the agreed upon amount. Also, Israel's banning the commercial sector from importing fuel of all types, despite it being explicitly in the agreement to permit this. Also, as Nora noted in the news up top, only 15 mobile homes have been delivered to Gaza of the 60,000 that were agreed to. And those 60,000 should have been in by the midway point of phase 1. So long overdue. Tents as well. Less than 20% of the 200,000 tents agreed upon have arrived. And again, we're talking about winter conditions in Gaza, and these tents have not arrived. People left their tents in the south when they moved north with the expectation that these tents would be delivered. So fundamental breaches here. Only 9 pieces of heavy machinery of the 500 agreed to. Again, these are critical pieces of machinery that are needed to clear the rubble in Gaza, to open the roads, to clear the trash, because the civil defense heavy machinery was targeted by Israel in a concerted and systematic way throughout the war. There's only been 5 ambulances allowed in, despite promises of many more. Rehabilitation of the hospitals infrastructure has not begun, also promised, agreed upon. And the rehabilitation of the power plant has been delayed. So blocking of critical parts that were supposed to be delivered. Field violations is the second. The Philadelphia corridor is supposed to be gradually being withdrawn from by day 50, which is 3 days from now. The Israeli military is supposed to be completely out of the Philadelphia corridor along the border with Egypt. The Israeli government has stated that they are not going to do that. Ahead of time. They're supposed to be pulling out 50 meters a day down the corridor, and that is not happening. Also, daily overflights. There's a prohibition on daily overflights for 10 hours a day and 12 hours a day on the days of the prisoner exchanges. Those have been violated 210 times, including by primarily by drones. And the number of field violations totals 962 violations. Those include 116 people killed, 490 injured. Those 210 aircraft violations that I just mentioned, gunfire and armored incursions are taking place. 77 incidences of gunfire towards Palestinian civilians. Armored vehicle incursions are 45, and the bombardment, like Abubaker was just talking about Rafah in particular, there's been more than 37 bombings by Israel during this time, and arresting fishermen. Israel has blockaded again. Constant blockade of fishermen, but that was supposed to be relieved and has not. And the Rafah crossing is supposed to be open for civilians to travel both ways. And the Philadelphia corridor I already touched on. Abu Obaida just gave an address just as we went on air, so I don't have much of that, but the thrust of what he was saying was expressing 𝐓𝐡𝐞's commitment to remain in the agreement. He pointed out the treatment of the prisoners, Israeli prisoners that have been released in comparison to the Palestinians who have been released in brutal condition, many going straight from the bus from the prison into taxis and taken to the hospital and buses to the hospital. So we are at the end of phase one. Phase one was 1,900 Palestinians exchanged for 33 Israelis. Stage two, there are 59 captives left. And according to the Israelis, at least 22 of them are alive, and we presume those are soldiers based on who was released in the first phase, which was supposed to be a humanitarian phase, although 12 soldiers were released in the humanitarian phase. So on to the Nahal Oz raid. If we just pull up this full map of Gaza, Nahal Oz is in the north. It's across from 𝐄𝐥𝐿. And just to note that the entire Gaza envelope runs along that red dotted line that is the border there. The Gaza envelope is a series of villages and military bases, kibbutz, moshavs, that are all along the border that literally envelop the Gaza Strip. If we look at the next map, we can see it up close where we're talking in northern Gaza. That area all along the Gaza envelope remains a closed military zone. There has not been reconstruction in the Gaza envelope. 4 kilometers deep is a closed military zone today, and Nahal Oz kibbutz is still has not been rebuilt, along with many of the other kibbutz. The base is not functioning, and much of the base was destroyed by airstrikes. If we look at the next map even closer, we can see the proximity from 𝐄𝐥𝐿, which is east of Gaza City, to Nahal Oz military base. This map doesn't have, the main maps don't have, you can go to Google Maps and look and you don't see Nahal Oz base, but it is a principal base, a core base for the military. It is the home of the Gaza Division's Northern Brigade and the Combat Intelligence Collection Corps. So it's a key base, and it was one of the main bases targeted on October 7th. The Israeli military has held up these investigations for more than 6 months. They didn't want to release these investigations during the war because the ones that have been released so far are underscored by devastating cowardice and failure, and they didn't want that while their soldiers were fighting in Gaza to be shown how badly and how comprehensively the Gaza division was dismantled, and the IDF at large on October 7th. The Nahal Oz example is a really strong one, and it matches with videos released by 𝐓𝐡𝐞, which allows us to compare both of those. So 𝐓𝐡𝐞 has made a complete video of the Nahal Oz raid, which I'm going to show you in a moment. And the reason why we know about what we know about October 7th is from the civilians, because it was more difficult to keep the civilians under wrap. But the military bases themselves have been covered by a strict military censor, and none of the information from inside the bases has been released since October 7th. And so this is the beginning of that. And yeah, like I said, we know about the civilians because they had the WhatsApp groups and they were communicating, and they spoke to the media and spoke amongst themselves primarily after and during October 7th. So we have heard from them, but we have not heard from the Israeli military. And just to note, the October Council Families Forum, which is the bereaved families of October 7th, they are not impressed by this investigation. They called the specific internal investigations into October 7th are only the tip of the iceberg and do not replace full state commissions. So these are preliminary investigations. They looked into 40 different battles, and the families of the bereaved families are not impressed by these reports. If we look at the next frame, you can see Nahal Oz. This is from Qassam's video. You can see on the left of your screen is the base, and up at the top to the right with that cluster of trees, that is the kibbutz Nahal Oz. And again, this is how Israel is built. This is the making military positions civilian positions in order to gain legitimacy for them, to use them as human shields. The history of Nahal Oz is a very telling story of the Gaza envelope. It was built in 1951 after the ethnic cleansing of southern Israel. And people were pushed as refugees into the Gaza Strip. In 1951, it was a military position for the Nahal Brigade, and 2 years later, the kibbutz was set up. And again, core MO to create human shields, to cast legitimacy on military positions, and establish, as Israel likes to call it, facts on the ground by moving in civilians. Nahal Oz was initially named literally in Hebrew, Nahal soldiers across from Gaza. That's what its literal name was. After a raid in 1956 from Gaza on the Nahal Oz kibbutz, Israeli military chief of staff Moshe Dayan talked about the Gaza envelope and Nahal Oz specifically. And I'm going to read to you from his eulogy for a security chief at Nahal Oz that was killed in a raid by fighters from Gaza. He said in the eulogy, "Let us not cast blame. For 8 years, they have been sitting in the refugee camps in Gaza, and before their eyes, we have been transforming the lands and villages where they and their fathers dwelt into our estate. How did we shut our eyes and refuse to look squarely at the fate and see in all its brutality the destiny of our generation? Have we forgotten that this group of young people dwelling at Nahal Oz is bearing the heavy weight of Gaza on its shoulders? Beyond the furrow of the border, a sea of hatred and desire for revenge is swelling, awaiting the day when serenity will dull our path. To the young security chief who left Tel Aviv to build his home at the gates of Gaza, to be a wall for us, the gates of Gaza weighed too heavily on his shoulders and overcame him." So right away, right from the beginning of the creation of the Gaza envelope, it was a target for raids, and it was put very bluntly that this security officer who was killed was being a wall for Israel, and that is the nature of the Gaza envelope. So the target of Nahal Oz is rich in symbolism and history. And let's take a look at that raid right now, because Qassam put together a full video on the raid, which I will walk you through. Right here, we're seeing the launch of the rockets that began the raid, the dropping from drones onto the sentry towers, the watch towers. We're watching now a drone strike on a patrol along the border. And again, the launch of rockets throughout the day, more than 4,000, which is more than the 2014 war. Here we're seeing fighters driving with literally rockets flying over their heads. There's the breach and the paragliders, famous sights from there from October 7th. Again, a very clean breach. I'm going to break these down. You'll get a chance to see them again, but they move quickly, but I'm going to break them down one by one after this video. You can see the fighters breaching here. There's breaches in more than 114 spots in the fence. And Israel talked a lot about how 5,500 people, terrorists, they said, crossed crossed into Israel on October 7th. But the real raid on 𝐓𝐿 is 162 Israeli military soldiers at 𝐓𝐿 base versus 65 Nukba elite 𝐓𝐡𝐞 forces that you're looking at here. These are the 65 forces that overran this base. And they overran this base, according to the Israeli report, within 15 minutes of touching the perimeter. And they touched the perimeter 10 minutes after crossing the fence. Essentially dismantled the Gaza division within minutes of this operation. You can see the fighters moving through the walls that they knew about. They understood the layout of the base. And one part of this story that's important to note is that the first people to flee were the Golani Brigade staff officers who up and left and ran off from the base and left their soldiers to fight. So within minutes, again, they're at the base. They reach the base, and you can see here they have captured all those vehicles. That's one of the automatic machine gun towers. There's the captured soldiers that would be taken back into Gaza. And there's the photo from the drone that I showed you before. Now we'll break these down one by one because there was 3 waves, but we're going to focus on the first wave. That was 65 Nukba special forces, 𝐓𝐡𝐞 elite forces that carried out this raid. There was a second and a third wave of 50 and 100 more that came at 9 a.m. and 10 a.m. But the raid itself is the raid that starts at 6:30. So let's look at number 4. This is the covering fire. This was critical to the functioning of the entire operation. Israel captured in Gaza a 𝐓𝐡𝐞 document during the war, according to this investigation, that detailed the attack on 𝐓𝐿 that said a steep trajectory of rocket fire will chase the soldiers into their shelters, which is exactly what happened. The soldiers fled into their shelters, left their positions, which was the purpose of the rocket fire. The rocket fire had 2 purposes. It also was fired at the Air Force air bases, which prevented planes from taking off and helicopters from taking off, and created confusion. But these rockets were fired at the bases to get the soldiers to hide, which they did, according to the IDF investigation. The IDF failed in the battle to protect 𝐓𝐿's base. The battle results express a systematic failure in the IDF's base readiness for a wide-scale ground attack accompanied by rocket fire. So 𝐓𝐡𝐞 knew what it was doing with this rocket fire. 1,406 rockets between 6:29 a.m. on October 7th and 7 a.m. when the raid inside 𝐓𝐿 had begun. If we look at number 5, the other critical part of this was the blinding operation. The blinding operation of the towers. You can see the way that drones are used to take out the towers. That's a critical aspect of this because it left the Israeli military blind. It took the electromagnetic spectrum away from them with all of their technology that links and communicates. They dropped all their communications. You can look at number 6, the use of the 𝐓𝐡𝐞 sniper rifle, which we saw all through Gaza during the war, being used to take out one of the automatic machine guns. According to the Israelis, all towers but one were destroyed in these minutes, these 10 minutes, less than 10 minutes after 6:29 a.m. when the operation began. If we look at number 7, this is the breaching video. The rocket fire starts at 6:29. At 6:34 a.m., the first breaches are happening. And you can see them there with the paraglider going across. This breach is very clean. And there's 114 of these breaches up and down the border of Gaza. And the Israelis, because of the blinding operation, the Israelis didn't know this part was happening. Only 40%, there was only 40% awareness of the 114 breaches by 7:30 a.m., 60% by 10 a.m., and 85% by 11:30 a.m. So by 11:30 a.m., when effectively the raid was over, Israel still didn't know how many breaches in the wall there were. If we look at the next slide, you can see the clear. Is this the next? Yeah, this is 8. You can see how clear clean the breach was. And this is something that 𝐓𝐡𝐞 trained years for under Israel's eyes. And there's all through the report about how they watched this training happen. Previous to Sinwar's leadership, the core training in Gaza happened at night. The fighters would train by and large at night. Sinwar changed that under his leadership in the late 2010s. They started training out in the open, and the women surveillance officers of the IDF talked about how they watched these operations, these breaching operations. 𝐓𝐡𝐞 would build replicas of the fence and blow it up. In the exact way that we saw. And you can see that breach right there is so well done that the truck that you look at in the bottom right-hand corner, the truck picks up the fighter who laid the breaching charge, and he hops in the truck, and the trucks drive through there. 𝐄𝐥𝐞 𝐈𝐧𝐭𝐫𝐿 base is only 850 meters away from 𝐓𝐡𝐞, so they were able to reach the base within minutes. At 6:45 a.m., the military study by the Israeli military said that the 𝐓𝐡𝐞 fighters had reached the perimeter of 𝐄𝐥𝐞 𝐈𝐧𝐭𝐫𝐿 base, and that breach that you're seeing on your screen right there, according to the camera of 𝐓𝐡𝐞, was at 6:37. So a rapid approach. If we look at number 9, I just wanted to show you the way they use drones to do this. You can see the targets in this one, and then the next slide you can see it launch. These are, and then this is the video of it. Up next, you can show that one tomorrow, number 12. These are 𝐓𝐡𝐞 drone grenades. These are M67 clones that 𝐓𝐡𝐞 built. This goes back to Adnan Al-Ghul creating these weapons, and they just used the hand grenades from the drones. And you can see here, you can see the 𝐓𝐡𝐞 elite forces waiting at that breach, and the drone is pushing back the Israeli soldiers at that breach. So there really is a combined operations. You see these soldiers, you see them scatter, and then watch when the camera zooms out down in the bottom left, you see the 𝐓𝐡𝐞 soldiers waiting there. So they're using air support. They're using a combined arms operation here to get through. It's pretty remarkable. And this video shows it very, very clearly. This is a combined arms operation in other ways too, and elsewhere on October 7th, because we know that 𝐓𝐡𝐞 fighters went in paragliders. They went by sea, so land, air, and sea, but ironically not by tunnel, which is what Israel thought the invasion would. If an invasion happened, it would be small scale, and it would be through a single tunnel. And that's what the wall, the iron wall that Israel built, is intended to stop tunnels. And the Palestinians just cut right through it. Okay, this next slide is going to have audio in it. And just as a heads up, it's got gunshots in it. So just be warned about that. But this is the breach of the base with the soundtrack from the video, number 13. So you can actually hear the incoming and outgoing rounds going by the heads of the soldiers in these. This is remarkable footage of an historic event. And you can see that they knew exactly where to go. And like I said earlier, senior staff officers had fled the base at this point. By 7:05 a.m., 𝐓𝐡𝐞 is inside the command center of the base. And by 8:30 a.m., they have it encircled. According to the report by the IDF, the level of detail in the document found in Gaza about 𝐄𝐥𝐞 𝐈𝐧𝐭𝐫𝐿 is better than IDF Special Forces dossiers the IDF probe found. The document detailed the exact layout of the base, including the bomb shelters, barracks, generator rooms, communication antennas, surveillance cameras, and the war room. 𝐓𝐡𝐞 knew where the commanders slept, how effective the shelters would be against rocket fire, how many soldiers had weapons, and where they stored those weapons. This is a Tier 1 Special Operations Force raid. That's my commentary. the quote had ended. My commentary is this is a tier 1 special operations force raid. If we look at number 14, this still is a memorable still, because this is the tower and fence that is all around Palestine. And when Palestine gets a modicum of justice, these towers will fall, and this is what is all wrapped around in the West Bank, and this moment where the fighter is reaching this tower, and he speaks. This fighter, he says, "Here are the sons of Qassam. Here are the sons of Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. Here are the sons of the Palestinian people. They are reclaiming what is called the Gaza envelope. These are our lands, our brothers. These are our lands." That's what the fighter's saying in that moment of that still shot. So fighters obviously keenly aware of the Gaza envelope in the exact same way that Moshe Dayan, the Israeli chief of staff in the 1950s, portended. Number 15, this is another still of them entering the base. And again, you can see how few fighters it is, how well organized they are. They had studied Nahal Oz from afar for years prior, according to the study. They knew where every room was. So complete, the study said, was their assessment from social media descriptions, often simply posts that soldiers snapped next to the different buildings in different rooms on their first or last day in that position as they rotated in and out. The Israeli military official probe of the battle has concluded that Qassam did not need a single spy to pull off its highly specific infiltration plan. They just did it with IDF's TikTok soldiers. TikTok soldiers did it before they went into Gaza and TikToked. They contributed to their forces being dismantled by their TikToks inside Israel. The interrogators and physical evidence that the IDF found that Hamas had built, that Qassam had built mock-ups of the IDF position, and they were able to build scale mock-ups and rehearse the attack and note the professional tactics used and the scale of the weaponry carried by Qassam. Their anti-armor ambushes were able to take out 3 main battle tanks and 2 armored personnel carriers. So this is consistent with the result on the base. If we look at 16, you can see the captured equipment. Qassam had all of those vehicles. You can see the Merkava tanks in the top right corner. Those are Ashgarit armored personnel carriers that you see along the bottom there, and Namr troop carriers as well. At 8:09 a.m., the Israeli military had a counterattack in place. Tanks and APCs arrived at 8:26 a.m. The 3 tanks were disabled and destroyed by Yassin fire. 1 tank hit by 2 Yassin strikes, and the tank was destroyed inside the base. At 10 a.m., soldiers from inside that tank were captured and taken back to Gaza. Nahal Oz, according to the Israeli military, Nahal Oz base was subject to the most Israeli Air Force airstrikes, 14 drone strikes inside the base, 6 helicopter strikes, Hellfire missile strikes, and 150 Apache 30 millimeter chain gun strikes inside the base. And this is something that upset the families of the bereaved. The families said that the Israeli military tampered with evidence, destroyed audio files after 5 a.m., critical audio files that talked about what was happening in the communications between 5 a.m. and 7 a.m. when this raid happened, and that the bases were destroyed. And that is the case with many of these bases on October 7th. Israel blew up the bases so that there wasn't evidence left for in the same way that after they Hannibaled all the cars, they buried the cars and took away that evidence. If we look at number 17, you can see the use of the drone strike on the left-hand side of your screen there. Aerial drone strike on a Merkava tank that disabled that tank. And again, there's 3 tanks taken out during the attempt to rescue. If we look at number 18, you can see the soldiers captured here. In all, 53 soldiers, Israeli soldiers, were killed inside the base at Nahal Oz. 10 soldiers were abducted. and brought to Gaza in Israeli military Hummers. So that is the video matching up pretty much exactly with the numbers. And if we look at this one last video, Nahal Oz has a history. I showed this before, but I want to show this. This is 2014 Qassam raid during the 2014 war on the Nahal Oz pillbox. This is 9 Qassam fighters who were in a tunnel for 17 days waiting in position. They pop out of this tunnels, and again, it's not very many fighters. It's a single squad, 9 fighters, 1 team, able to use the tunnel to get close to the Nahal Oz pillbox. This pillbox was also destroyed after this raid. Israel denied that this raid happened at the time, and Qassam released this video a few days later, and the Israelis looked like the liars that they are. Consistent. Without these videos of the resistance, you can see an early scene there in the with the fighter right there with his helmet cam. This is a foreshadowing of many of the operations of this past war from 2014. And this is up till this point was one of the most significant raids carried out by Palestinian forces, and they came very close on this raid to capturing an Israeli soldier. They timed this raid. They had an internal clock of 10 minutes before, because they knew also on October 7th, they knew how long, and Israel found this in their documents, that they knew how long it would take for each type of vehicle to respond to the attack. They knew that at Nahal Oz, and that's in 2014. And that's what times their raid here. And they knew it on October 7th. And that's why they were able to ambush that rescue force that came on October 7th. They knew it was coming. They knew the timing, and they had part of their squad waiting for it to destroy it. So these are elite forces, special forces. They're called Nukba forces in Qassam, but they're based. This raid is principally carried out by the Shujaiya battalion. And there was 3 waves. I'm just focusing on the first wave of October 7th, but there was 3 waves that we'll get into more in the coming weeks as more of these investigations come out. So here they are entering the pillbox. You can see in a moment here a soldier who tries to flee. It is in the process of being captured. Had he been captured, this would have been a story that everyone in the world would have heard about, like when the tank gunner that everybody knows his name was captured in 2006, and it became a story, and 1,000 prisoners were released, including Yahya Sinwar. You can see there where the blur is blurred out there. They have a soldier captured, and one Israeli fires from the tower and hits one of the Qassam fighters, but they don't murder, they don't execute the soldier on the spot. They move, they take his gun here. They took his Tavor X95, which we've seen in many of the prisoner exchange releases videos, where you see the Qassam fighters holding, there you see the weapon there. At this point, this was the only one that was in Gaza, but October 7th, they captured a whole bunch of them. So this is a historic raid. All 9 fighters emerged back through the same tunnel safely. They brought their injured comrade back. They didn't capture the soldier, but they captured the gun. And so Nahal Oz has a long history from from its creation right through the last 2 important wars in Gaza. So that is the resistance report for this week, the Nahal Oz raid, and I will be reporting on more of these Israeli military studies that come out. There is supposed to be 40 of them coming out. Just the tip of the iceberg, as was said.
Wow. 40 reports that are coming
40
out.
battles. Reports
40
for 40 battles.
Amazing.
There was 40 different battles on October 7th.
And this is just between like 6:30 in the morning and 10:30 in the morning, right? On October 7th.
Yeah,
like
so
that.
the three raids, the second raid happened, the second wave happens, and this is something we don't know a lot about, the second and third waves, and then after that are civilians coming across the border. And like I said, Israel says 5,600 swarmed across the border. That's not what happened. Several hundred Nukba forces at 6:45 in the morning crossed the border. And then there was a second wave around 9 a.m. and a third wave around 10 a.m. And you can imagine that those second and third waves were dependent on the first wave, because there's no way 𝐓𝐡𝐞 believed that the Gaza division would crumble in the speed that it did, or they would have sent more fighters to capture more soldiers. So those second and third waves are a little more ad hoc, and then you have civilians coming across. And that's how Israel spins it, by saying that they were overwhelmed by the hordes of 5,600 people flooding into Israel. But that's not the case. What happened was a few hundred special forces from the 𝐓𝐡𝐞 brigades dismantled the Gaza division.
There's a couple of things that strike me about this, John. That was really brilliant work to match up the 𝐓𝐡𝐞 video with what we learned from the Israeli report. One thing, just a general impression, we've been saying from the beginning that October 7th was primarily an assault on the Israeli military, and the Israeli military was defeated on October 7th. And that's very clear from what you showed us today, as well as what we've been reporting for more than a year. And just how far that is from the popular narrative that people, particularly in the West, have been indoctrinated with since October 7th, that this was primarily an attack on civilians. Again, that's not to say that no civilians were harmed in the course of this, but the goal was not to primarily harm civilians. And of course, then that narrative is accompanied by all the lies which Israel and the United States government continue to tell about burned babies and mass rapes and so on. So that's just one general observation I wanted to make. The other thing I know from, one of the earlier studies done by the army was of what happened in Kibbutz Be'eri, because of the families there who wanted to know how Israel killed their own loved ones. And David Sheen and I did a really detailed analysis of that report and found that it was actually a whitewash, and it covered up the cannibalizing of the Israelis in Kibbutz Be'eri, of which there's ample documentation. So my question to you is there's obviously some truth in these reports, so that they're not entirely what they are, at least in the Kibbutz Be'eri report. It was an attempt to square the army's fictional narrative with the facts they couldn't hide. And so my question for you is, how much of that spin are you seeing in this report, or do you expect to see in the other reports that will be coming out?
Well, to your first question, so 200 Nukba forces in the three waves go to the military base. 14 secure the kibbutz. So the kibbutz isn't even a target. They're just securing the kibbutz. If the kibbutz is right beside the base, they could have ran past the base to the kibbutz, but they didn't do that. They focused on the base, and the kibbutz needed to be held, because you could see by that aerial image I showed you, they're interconnected. That's how they operate. The base is interconnected with the kibbutz, and then the kibbutz has its own security that's linked up to the IDF itself. So they are hand in glove. That's how they function. So 200 versus 14. About the Hannibal stuff, you can see that trying to be squared. Nahal Oz received the most airstrikes inside the base. And then by 10:30 a.m., the Israelis, because of the rocket fire on the Israeli Air Force bases, they didn't get planes in the air in time. And because of the blinding operation, they weren't communicating properly. Planes don't really get in. The first drone strike is before 8 a.m., but the major drone strikes don't really start until 10:30. And at that point, they're killing anybody that is between the base and the fence. Anyone is being killed, and that is the order. And you can see clearly the gap where the Hannibal numbers come in. They are trying to they're trying to say that they're trying to limit the damage of the Hannibal, but they have that clearly in these documents. They admit to friendly fire. They admit to not knowing. I mean, the fundamental thing about the Hannibal is they admit to not having targeting information because of the communications were down, because the staff officers in Nahal Oz, they literally climbed out the bathroom window and ran away. The guys who were supposed to be communicating with the planes. And so the planes didn't have any, we're going off like we reported like in October of 2023, they were going off WhatsApp groups on their phones to target. They didn't know who they were targeting. So to open fire on anybody in between the base and the wall is killing Israelis and Palestinians.
Yeah, the order that went over the Gaza division's communication system was not a single vehicle can return to Gaza. That's a quote from the report in Haaretz last year, and that was at 11:22 a.m. And also we know, as we've reported before, we know from Yediot Ahronot, the Roland Bergman, Yoav Zeytun long investigation in January last year, that there was a general order at midday for the Hannibal Directive to be used all over the region. But we know that it started before that. It started very early on as well, just by the initiative of the Israeli military operatives working in the area, drones and so forth. And because that's what they'd been trained to do. This is what was said by the Israeli Air Force colonel, whose name escapes me at the moment, who described it as a mass Hannibal. And he made that point that we'd been trained to do this for 20 years. So the orders confirming it were really just recognizing the reality of what had happened. And
yeah, these investigations are very preliminary. This is certainly not the last word on this. But based on what we have at Nahal Oz, you have Hannibal at 10:30 a.m. from Nahal Oz, but you have airstrikes before 8 a.m.
And there was the Hannibal at Erez as well.
That's right.
Which was very early, as I recall from your reporting, Asa. The Hannibal at Erez was...
Yeah, Hannibal at Erez.
It's like 7:30 in the morning or something like
they're
that.
They're striking inside the bases by before 8 a.m. They're carrying out drone strikes inside these small bases. So, and then ultimately, many of the bases never were actually reclaimed by the IDF. They were just destroyed with everyone in them.
What struck me as well from your map that you showed at the beginning of your segment, John, was that Nahal Oz was, of course, protecting Kfar Aza, which is the one of the kibbutzes, which means Gaza village in Hebrew, which is pretty sick, really, considering the reasons it was built. But if you looked at the footage very early on, in the aftermath of October 7th, of Kfar Aza in particular, very similarly to Kibbutz Be'eri, the scenes of destruction are very, very, very clear that it's caused by Israeli artillery shelling of various kinds. The completely destroyed houses, completely flattened. I mean, I've been saying this since the beginning. Like, the reason we recognized straight away that the Hannibal Directive was being carried out against civilians, Israeli civilians, for the first time that we know of, was because, to me, some of the scenes in some of the kibbutzes looked like Gaza, looked like previous wars, Israeli wars against Gaza, where homes had been flattened, vehicles had been flattened. It looked very similar in some ways, and so we could recognize straight away the weapons being used against Israeli civilians were Israeli weapons and not Palestinian weapons.
Yeah, and because they have no targeting information, they're just firing away.
Exactly. You know, it's not all a case of, you know, it was definitely Hannibaling that took place, we know, but it was the mass Hannibal, where there was this indiscriminate fire, where they were shooting at everything that moves. Not a single vehicle can return to Gaza. They don't necessarily know what they're shooting at.
Yeah,
it's a very chaotic situation.
We'll have much more, obviously, in the coming weeks. Thanks so much for that, John. But we wanted to get through a few discussion items. As you mentioned, John, Abu Abeda, the spokesperson for the Qassam Brigades, delivered an address just while we've been on air. And this is something that Sarah Leah Whitson had talked about at the top of the show. The U.S. Saying that it didn't give Israel advance notice that it would be holding talks with Hamas. Ali, why don't you bring us up to date on the significance of that? Maybe flesh that out a little bit more. And, as Sarah was saying, it's the first time, I think, ever that a U.S. administration has been willing to actually go to a Palestinian political faction in direct negotiations with matters that involve Palestinian rights, besides, of course, the subcontractor of the PA. But what's the significance of this?
Yeah, there's a lot. I want to lay the context, if I can, and then get into some of this, because I think it's a lot of the events that are going on are sort of interwoven and have to be thought of together. And I prepared all my notes yesterday, and then so many other things happened, and that's the way it is. So you're trying to keep up to the last minute. There's been breaking news even in the last couple of hours while we've been on air. So so yes, it's now been confirmed that the United States, the White House itself confirmed that the U.S. representative on hostages, Adam Boehler, met with Hamas officials, and in fact continued to meet with them through last night and into today in Doha in Qatar. But let's go back. We'll come back to that. But let's go back to Tuesday and what happened with Trump's State of the Union address. This was his first big address, first big speech since reassuming office in January. And he said remarkably little about Palestine during that speech, and that surprised many people. Let's take a look at what he did say, Tamara. Let's play that video.
At least we're bringing back our hostages from Gaza. In my first term, we achieved one of the most groundbreaking peace agreements in generations, the Abraham Accords. And now we're going to build on that foundation to create a more peaceful and prosperous future for the entire region. A lot of things are happening in the Middle East. People have been talking about that so much lately with everything going on with Ukraine and Russia. But a lot of things are happening in the Middle East. It's a rough neighborhood, actually.
So that was a lot. Yeah, that was a longish clip, but that was really all he said. So it was about less than a minute in a speech that was over an hour and a half. And there were no great declarations of love for Israel, which I thought was interesting, and no threats against Hamas, and no repetition of his Riviera Trump Gaza dreams. And I thought that was interesting. And it was also notable that throughout his speech, Trump paid personal tribute to many of the guests who had been brought into the House chamber, praising them as the camera focused on their reactions. But he didn't point out the former Israeli captives in Gaza, including Noah Argamani and Yair Hon, or the family members of U.S. citizens who are still in Gaza, who are watching as the president spoke. And I would have found it hard to imagine that Joe Biden would have skipped them over that way. But there was something else in the speech that caught my attention, and that was not directly about Palestine. It was when Trump was talking about Russia and Ukraine. Let's listen to this short clip.
Time to stop this madness. It's time to halt the killing. It's time to end the senseless war. If you want to end wars, you have to talk to both sides.
Yeah, and I remember when I was watching the speech on Tuesday night, I thought, well, that actually makes sense, but I wondered why that didn't apply to Palestine as well. But of course, the very next day, on Wednesday, we learned that in fact the United States is talking to Hamas, and this news was broken by the website Axios, which reported that the Trump administration has been holding direct talks with Hamas over the release of U.S. hostages held in Gaza and the possibility of a broader deal to end the war. Two sources with direct knowledge of the discussions tell Axios. And then the New York Times also reported on Wednesday that U.S. and Hamas officials have held talks in Qatar about hostages held in the Gaza Strip, according to two Israeli officials and a Western official and a diplomat briefed on the matter, breaking with long-standing American policy of refusing to directly engage with groups that it has designated as terrorists. And the New York Times also revealed that the United States did not consult Israel in advance, and that Israel learned about this through other channels.
What does that mean?
We
That's
don't know.
really interesting.
What are these other channels?
Yeah. I mean, that sounds like spying on the Israeli spying on the US, to be frank, but it's also very
It wouldn't have been the
interesting
first time either, of course.
Like, I believe Trump said soon after this that Israel did know about this beforehand, or I read that somewhere else. Maybe it wasn't Trump's Truth Social. I forget the source now, but that strikes me as a sort of after the fact justification by the Israelis of trying to sort of, I don't know, keep on top of events.
We don't know who told them. I mean, it could have been someone in the U.S. We don't know. That's speculation, but it is interesting that the U.S. didn't tell Israel in advance, because usually they coordinate on everything that has to do with the Palestinians. And all that seemed quite positive, pragmatic, and momentous, and as the reporting says, a significant departure from the policy of all previous administrations. But it was in keeping with the precedent set by Trump during his first administration, when he agreed to negotiate with the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan directly with the Taliban. And those negotiations were also held in Doha and Qatar. And of course, Trump also spoke to or met with the North Korean leader during his first term. And in this term is talking directly to Russia, which was the context of the clip we just saw. But then a few hours later comes this really horrifying social media posting from Donald Trump, which I'll read. It's for those who are listening, but I think people have to hear it to sort of compare and contrast. And he says, "Shalom Hamas means hello and goodbye. You can choose. Release all of the hostages now, not later, and immediately return all of the dead bodies of the people you murdered, or it is over for you. Only sick and twisted people keep bodies and you are sick and twisted. I'm sending Israel everything it needs to finish the job. Not a single Hamas member will be safe if you don't do as I say. I have just met with your former hostages whose lives you have destroyed. This is your last warning. For the leadership, now is the time to leave Gaza while you still have a chance. Also, to the people of Gaza, a beautiful future awaits you, but not if you hold hostages. If you do, you are dead. Make a smart decision. Release the hostages now, or there will be hell to pay later. So, an apparently explicit threat also against the entire civilian population in Gaza. And of course, when he said that only sick and twisted people keep bodies, he probably didn't know that he was referring to Israel, which has had a policy for decades of keeping the bodies of Palestinians as a spiteful form of collective punishment against their families. And in 2019, the Israeli High Court explicitly authorized the government to hold on to the bodies of Palestinians for use as bargaining chips in negotiations. You see that right there on the from B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights group. A couple of new developments that I want to point to. I think it makes sense to. Well, actually, I want to come to a report that just came out in Haaretz while we've been on air, but let me just say that this threat is very disturbing. But I think, Asa, you pointed out in one of our private discussions earlier that this is not the first time we've heard these almost verbatim threats. This seems a bit more explicit, but
yeah, it seems like it seems like the third time. Like he's made a very direct threat that Hamas must release all the so-called hostages immediately, otherwise, you'll regret it. There'll be hell to play, and so on and so forth. By now, it's starting to look like an empty threat.
Well, maybe that's what I want to get to. Is it an empty threat? And I'm working my way there, so bear with me. But he also, and as I think you pointed out, Asa, made a threat like this just before the January 19th ceasefire took hold. So, is it a negotiating tactic? Again, also we saw it in that meeting with Netanyahu in the White House a few weeks ago, just before they returned, Israel and the US returned again to implementing the ceasefire deal after apparently threatening to pull out of it. Some news reports that came this morning tell us that, let me see, a few headlines that broke this morning. Let me just find my place in my notes. That Egyptian sources, this is from Reuters, Egyptian sources said on Thursday that a U.S. envoy held talks with Hamas leaders and mediators from Egypt and Qatar overnight into Thursday. According to the sources, the discussions ended positively and indicate a near transition to the second stage of a ceasefire with Israel. The sides discussed governance in Gaza after the war, including names of those who had managed the territory, according to the sources. That's very interesting, because if those reports are true, then that tells us this is about something far broader than just the release of captives who are U.S. citizens. And then another report, this is in Haaretz, which says the U.S. proposed that Hamas release 10 living hostages in exchange for extending the Gaza ceasefire by 2 months. Washington proposed that Hamas release 10 living hostages in exchange for a 2-month extension of the Gaza ceasefire, including the resumption of humanitarian aid. A Palestinian source told Sky News Arabia. According to the report, Hamas is reviewing the proposal. Also today, Hamas reiterated its commitment to the truce and says the mediators continue efforts to compel Israel to start the second stage of negotiations, which, as John has reminded us this week and in previous weeks, those second phase negotiations were supposed to have started some time ago and haven't yet. Now, couple more interesting things, and then I want to get to this item in Haaretz. That, as I said, Trump didn't mention the hostages, really. He just mentioned them in passing, or the released captives, in his State of the Union address. But he met with them on Wednesday in the Oval Office, and it was just after he met them that he posted that really horrific post, genocidal post. And what's notable is that the former Israeli captives who met Trump on Wednesday issued a statement thanking Trump and his Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff for making their release possible by brokering the ceasefire deal, and urged them to continue their efforts to get the rest out. According to the Times of Israel, freed captive Eli Sharabi said the group met with Trump, quote, to ensure that the 59 hostages still being held will be released through an agreement for their return as soon as possible, and thanked the US president and Witkoff for being committed to this goal. So the words through an agreement, I think, are important there.
And just to point out, Hamas has proposed since the very beginning in October 2023 for an all-for-all, captive exchange. You empty the Israeli prisons, the Israeli torture camps of the thousands and thousands of Palestinian men, women, and children, and Israel gets its captives back. It is not, and in exchange for lifting the siege and adhering to international laws, ending the occupation. And Israel has been the one over and over again to reject this.
Right. So you're completely right, Nora. And none of what we're saying now is about whether Hamas is willing to commit to the agreement. The question is whether Israel and the United States are willing to commit to the agreement that they signed, that the United States helped broker. And an interesting thing, I mean, of course, there would have been no agreement without the resistance forcing Israel to accept a ceasefire. That's always has to be in the foreground. But ironically, one of the driving forces apparently keeping the deal on track so far on the Israeli and American side appears to be Miriam Adelson, the fanatically anti-Palestinian widow of casino mogul Sheldon Adelson. And as everyone knows, she very famously gave Donald Trump a $100 million donation. The Adelsons did that in 2022. As well.
He said moving the embassy to Jerusalem was kind of a quid pro quo for Adelson's support.
Yeah, and people are saying now that Adelson has a great deal of influence over Trump. Well, apparently she does. But what she has been pushing for is for the ceasefire deal to keep going. And in fact, the Israeli captives, former captives who met with Trump on Wednesday, were actually flown to Washington on Miriam Adelson's private jet. And it was reported in early February that she personally intervened with Trump to stop Netanyahu from sabotaging the deal and returning to war. An article by Uri Misgav in Haaretz on February 12th states the following. This is from February 12th, so almost a month ago. Quote, Netanyahu is determined to resume the war and end the hostage and ceasefire deal. It may well be that by the time you are reading this, it will already have happened. Trump has proposed or has been persuaded to open the gates of hell. Miriam Adelson started up her private plane and flew to Washington on Wednesday, this is back in early February, to convince him to put a stop to it before we reach the abyss. So that's very interesting. Now, the final point I want to make on this before we sort of throw it open is this story, Tamara. I'm going to drop it in the StreamYard chat that appears in Haaretz today. And the headline is, new Israeli army chief set to present plans to resume fighting in Gaza, retake key areas. A very scary headline. And then it says, the plan that Eyal Zamir is expected to present includes the deployment of several divisions across Gaza, which would require the IDF to enlist more reservists. Now, keep in mind what Donald Trump said yesterday, which is, I've given Israel everything they need to finish the job. And now here we have the Israeli army chief. We're going to put together a plan to finish the job. Well, not so fast. Let's read what Haaretz actually says here. Israel Defense Forces Chief of Staff Eyal Zamir is set to hold a situational assessment on Thursday evening, during which he's expected to present plans for the resumption of widespread fighting in Gaza. Defense officials say that Zamir's plan would necessitate several divisions that would retake areas across Gaza, including areas that the Israeli army left during the first stage of the ceasefire agreement. Sources with knowledge of the plan's details have cast doubt over the IDF's ability to draft the amount of reserve soldiers needed to implement such a plan over a sustained period of time. Several defense officials who spoke with Haaretz say that the army is having difficulties filling the ranks of the reserve divisions, and many reservists have already said they would have difficulties enlisting for several months once again. Other officials said that in some of the reserve brigades, only 50% of those summoned for duty have showed up, forcing those brigades to enlist reservists from other units within the army. Additionally, sources said that many officers in the IDF reserves have made it clear that they plan to end their service and not continue volunteering for combat operations in Gaza, citing their belief that the return to fighting is based on political considerations, all the while endangering the lives of the hostages held in Gaza, which was the main motivating factor to enlist since October 7th. And it goes on to talk about commanders in the reserve say that the amount of burnout of reservists and the condition of the equipment will make it hard for some brigades and units to enter combat with the same capabilities that they did at the start of the war. So does that sound to you like the Israeli army is ready to go back to full-scale war? Of course, we can never be sure or underestimate them. But notice what Donald Trump said. He didn't say that America is going to go to war in Gaza. No U.S. troops, no boots on the ground. He said Israel would do it. Israel would, open the gates of hell on Gaza. So the question here is, if we're to try to assess the situation, from October 7th, as John showed us, until now, the Israeli army remains defeated. And Trump has verbally signaled to Israel multiple times, including when Netanyahu was in the White House, you want to go back to war? I'm not going to stop you. We're going to give you whatever you want. And yet Israel hasn't. And here we have, even with all these crazy statements from Trump, reports not just of serious negotiations moving towards phase 2, but serious negotiations that are directly between the United States and Hamas. So while nothing is certain, I guess the adage, watch what they do and not what they say, is going to help guide us through this.
I think the Israeli military, the soldiers know at this point that they're not going back into Gaza to save the captives. Like they believed that. Many of them, you can see in their testimonies, many of them believed that they were going into Gaza to rescue their comrades and the other Israelis that were in Gaza. And very quickly they realized that wasn't an objective of any of their battles. And then they went back and fought in the same places 3 and 4 times, Jabalia 5 times. And none of those times were they trying to get their captives back. And so at some point, they're verbally expressing the fact that the way to get their captives back is to negotiate. And so they're going to end up I think by and large being on the side of wanting to continue to get their captives back, who are their soldiers, who are they're supposedly committed to, and they hope as soldiers themselves that the rest of their military will be committed to them when they end up in Gaza in a tunnel, which is sure to happen again in the future. So I think I'm not surprised that they're not gung-ho to go back and fight in these places that they couldn't win the first time.
Yeah, I think that what's really interesting about that Haaretz article, Ali, that you brought out there was the fact that the Israelis cannot sustain and remand their reserve battalions, and that very much lined up with what we were reporting before the ceasefire, which is that the Israeli army was, and the Israeli military in general, was essentially very close to collapse, just in terms of its manpower. Like John was saying, they were returning 2, 3, 4 times to the same places in the Gaza Strip, supposedly having dealt with them, having cleared them, and every time returning again and again, and just getting absolutely burnt out. And this makes sense with what, why would Miriam Adelson, the leading Israel lobby financier in the United States, she's an Israeli as it goes, but who funds, as well as Trump funds, all these pro-Israel lobby groups, why would she be supportive of a ceasefire? Well, in a sense, for Israel, it's better that they have a sort of managed ceasefire than a complete collapse of their forces, which sounds impossible, right? But it's always impossible till it happens, and they wouldn't want to see a repeat of what happened to them in South Lebanon in 2000.
So what happens next? I mean, I saw reports before we went on air that there were rumblings that Israel had kind of quietly, reluctantly agreed to continue the negotiations and move to stage 2, even though there hasn't been an official announcement yet. I mean, where do we stand? We're kind of in this no man's land, time and space.
Israel is in a situation where, or let's say, they can't go back to fighting for the reasons we've discussed, but if they declare an end to the war, then they also look defeated.
Right.
So it's sort of a checkmate situation for them. We heard our friends in Gaza telling us that nobody wants to go back to the war, but people have seen the worst and they're not going to surrender. So it's not like more of the same is going to produce a different result.
And that's essentially what Abubaker said too in the transcript, a little note that I saw. Yeah.
And he said, I still haven't watched his whole speech, but just from the headlines we're seeing, that he said, and that's the same message that's been coming from the political leadership, Hamas is committed to the deal as long as the other parties are committed to it, but they're ready for anything. Yeah. And I think that's also the importance of the of the military displays which Hamas put on during the first weeks of the ceasefire, when they were returning the captives that John broke down for us week after week, because that was also critically important to signal to everyone, especially the Israelis and the Americans, that we're not a spent force. Your choices are to continue with this process in which you get your people back, or to go back to a war which we're ready for and whose consequences and whose results are not going to be different for you. Yeah. And so that's where we are. And then I suppose this ties into, I know that we're coming up against kind of where we want to end, but we want to maybe say a few things about the Arab League summit and the Egyptian plan.
Yeah, Ali, just maybe just give us like a thumbnail sketch of
Yeah.
what the summit was. This had been delayed for a long time. It finally happened last week or
Yes,
earlier
it's one
this
of
week.
these Arab League emergency summits that are
Yeah,
scheduled like a month out,
yeah,
what if it was not an emergency,
right.
So, and the communique, and there were some absences from the summit, some notable absences. I don't want to get into all that, that's more than we can talk about now. But let's just say that the communique, I mean, there weren't great surprises in it. Anyone who's expecting the Arab regimes to suddenly turn into, bastions of resistance against the United States and Israel will definitely be disappointed by this communique. But the key points, and I think what people were looking for, is complete rejection of the idea of transfer.
Yeah.
They say that to reaffirm the summit resolves to reaffirm the unwavering Arab position as emphasized in the Bahrain Declaration of May 16, 2024, categorically rejecting any displacement of Palestinians from their land, whether internal or external, under any pretext. Such actions constitute a grave violation of international law, a crime against humanity, and so on. We condemn policies of starvation designed to force Palestinians to leave their homes. They condemn the Israeli government's decision to halt humanitarian aid, and so on. They warn that any attempts to displace Palestinians or annex occupied Palestinian territory will plunge the region into renewed conflict. And they resolve to adopt the Egyptian plan for the early recovery and reconstruction of Gaza, developed in full coordination with Palestine and Arab nations and based on studies by the World Bank, the UN Development Fund, and so on, and to prioritize the full implementation of the ceasefire agreement, holding all parties, especially Israel, to their commitments. There's a lot more boilerplate in the communique about the unwavering commitment to the two-state solution and, all this sort of stuff that you would expect from them. But those, I think, are the key points. And then just to very quickly go over sort of the nuts and bolts of the Gaza reconstruction plan put together under Egypt's sponsorship. And Al Jazeera had a very good article summarizing the key points. There are longer of documents available that detail it, but just some of the key points from Al Jazeera. It's a $53 billion altogether program. The first stage would last about 6 months, while the next two phases would take place over 4 to 5 years. The aim is to reconstruct Gaza, maintain peace and security, and reassert the governance of the Palestinian Authority in the territory 17 years after it was kicked out following the fighting between Fatah, which dominates the PA, and Hamas. That's Al Jazeera's language. So there's a six-month interim period, which would require a committee of Palestinian technocrats operating under the management of the PA to clear the rubble from Salahuddin Street, which is the main north-south highway in the Gaza Strip. The long-term reconstruction requires an additional 4 to 5 years. Over that span, the plan aims to build at least 400,000 permanent homes, as well as rebuilding Gaza's seaport and international port, and restore basic services, waste, communications, water, and so on. Now, the plan calls for a group of independent Palestinian technocrats to manage affairs in Gaza, in effect replacing Hamas. The technocratic government would be responsible for overseeing humanitarian aid and would pave the way for the PA to administer Gaza, according to Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the Egyptian ruler. Speaking at Tuesday's summit, this is the Arab League summit, PA President Mahmoud Abbas said that an election could take place next year if circumstances allowed. I'm sure they won't if Mahmoud Abbas has anything to do with it. And then finally, on the security front, Egypt and Jordan have both pledged to train Palestinian security officers and deploy them to Gaza. The two countries have also called on the United Nations Security Council to consider authorizing a peacekeeping mission to Gaza until reconstruction is possible. So those are the elements of the plan. Not all of them are new. They're things we've heard before. Some of the sticking points, Hamas has welcomed the plan. And then this is what Al Jazeera says, but I think this is a fair analysis. Hamas has welcomed the reconstruction plan and has previously agreed to a technocratic government, but it is less clear if it will accept the return of the PA, which itself would face the perception from its critics that it has returned to Gaza on the back of Israel's tanks. Hamas may be willing to discuss its removal from governance, but it is adamantly against its disarmament, something the Egyptian plan adopted by the Arab League did not discuss, and nor did the communique mention that. So, of course, as noted, Hamas has broadly welcomed it. The US and Israel have rejected it. I don't take the US rejection to be sort of clear and final. I don't think it was made at a senior enough level, and there's enough vagueness and confusion in this administration that I think we'll have to wait and see what this position is. And France endorsed it, and I'm just going to read this quote from France, which, if this attitude is repeated by Israel and its backers like France, I think will lead to a stalemate. France said, quote, "The proposal from Arab leaders constitutes a serious, credible basis to respond to reconstruction, governance, and security needs after the Gaza war," French Foreign Ministry spokesman Christophe Lemoine said, "but the plan must entirely exclude Hamas from governing Gaza, where it must be disarmed and give Israel serious security guarantees." So the Jews, I'm interpreting now, the Jewish victims of the Holocaust have to give serious security guarantees to the Nazi regime that murdered them. That's really the essence of the French position. And anyone else who says that that the resistance should be disarmed while the Palestinian people remain under occupation. And of course, I suppose maybe the French military could go to Gaza and try to disarm the resistance. Maybe when they're done with the mission that Emmanuel Macron, Keir Starmer want to send Ukraine, maybe they could send the troops, whatever they can scrape up, to Gaza to go and disarm the 𝐓𝐡𝐞 brigades. Let's see how that goes.
Unbelievable. Wow. Yeah. I mean, like, is there going to be another, so-called emergency Arab League summit, more down the line? I mean, to many people, I think it looks pretty performative. Again, there was nothing, drastically different from, the stated positions of those leaders in previous conferences or statements or press releases. But, I guess it remains to be seen if Egypt is serious about helping to rebuild Gaza.
I think the glass half full part of this is that, the Arab regimes are saying, don't expect us to go and liberate Palestine. They're not going to do that. They're never going to do more than they do now. But they're also saying we are not going to go along with any ethnic cleansing plans. We're not going to go along with turning Gaza into a Riviera. And the communique also stressed the key roles, I forget the language, it's somewhere here in my notes, of Egypt and Jordan as, let me just see if I can find that sentence.
Yeah,
they say here, we recognize, this is in the communique, we recognize the crucial role of Jordan and Egypt in confronting displacement and the liquidation of the Palestinian cause. So this was also them saying, look, we're rallying around Jordan and Egypt in the face of this threat to displace the Palestinian people. So it was maybe I think it was it did more than the minimum, and it was politically sufficient if you understand that you're never going to get very much from the Arab League.
Right. All right. Well, there is so much more we could talk about, obviously, but we are at 3 hours. So I want to wrap up. Let's take a quick look at the website. We have a bunch of new extraordinary features by our writers in Gaza. And as I mentioned in the news report, a new feature by a new writer in the West Bank, 𝐓𝐡𝐞 which we're very excited about. And we have an op-ed from our friend 𝐓𝐡𝐞 𝐄𝐥𝐞𝐜 in Lebanon. There's just so much there this week. We also have, of course, news reports, analyses, and 2 new podcasts this week in the blog section, in the podcast section. There is just last night, Tamara and I published an interview I did with members of Taxpayers Against Genocide, which wraps really nicely into the interview that we just did today with Sarah Leah Whitson about holding lawmakers accountable financially and legally. So give that a watch or a listen. And earlier in the week, we published a podcast with Dr. Mimi Sayed, an emergency doctor who did 2 medical missions to Gaza, and she has CAT scans that she showed in that video of a popular TikToker, Amido Halimi, who was most likely assassinated by an Israeli sniper drone after an Israeli air attack last year. So she has just an extraordinary amount of information there. Disturbing, but important. And so please go to electronicintifada.net to read all of those, to, of course, sign up for our email address. If you can and are able, please throw in a couple bucks as a donation to keep this platform, this publication, this live stream running.
Everything you see, all of this work, everything you've seen on this live stream, everything you see on the website, the incredible reporting from the ground in Gaza, from the West Bank, the analysis and commentary, these fantastic interviews, Nora, that you did, that brilliant report that Jon just gave us on the Nahal Oz raid, the reporting we do on the situation in Gaza, which, as I mentioned at the outset, is absent from the front pages today of all the major news outlets that we're told are trustworthy and reliable. And that's why we're here. And we can only do this with the support of the people watching and listening today. And so I just want to take this opportunity, as we cannot do often enough, to say thank you for supporting our work. Thank you for being here for the long haul. We are going to be here for the long haul, as we have been throughout and before the genocide, and will continue to be. And thank you in particular to everyone. It's actually hundreds of people who have made the commitment to give us a monthly donation, which you can set up by going to the website and clicking donate now. You can make a one-time donation or set up a monthly donation, I think for as little as $5 or $10 a month, if you can and if you want to. You can give us as much as you want. There's no limit on that. But the key thing is that you are what makes this possible. And as Nora said, and I can't stress this enough too, don't give us any money if you can't afford it. If it's going to put you or your family in any hardship, please don't. But lots of people have a bit of extra money, or can do it, and then you're making this available to the whole world, because we will never charge for this reporting. We will never charge a subscription or put up a paywall. Our mission is to make this information available to everyone in the world forever, and so help us do that. And thank you to those who already have. We cannot say it enough.
Yes, thank you. Yes, thank you, Ali. And thank you, of course, to Tamara Nassar for directing and producing this live stream and all of the podcasts that we do, the standalone episodes as well. Thank you, Tamara. And Maureen Claire Murphy, our senior editor. Michael F. Brown for fact-checking, Ellie Gerzon for social media production, and on behalf of myself and Tamara and John and Asa and Ali and everyone at the Electronic Intifada, thank you, and we will see you next week.